Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the main street during this lonesome, quiet and unassuming time of year seems sleepy, with overhanging grey clouds contemplating rain. Everything is steeped in a long, lingering, drawn-out silence, for winter, like a black panther, had made her stealth-like, clandestine approach. She cruelly snatched the last vestiges of autumn away, grabbing her by the jugular until she hemorrhages out the last of her withering leaves, which had fallen to the ground in haste and had long since been blown away by the breeze. The sorrowful, lugubrious skeletons of ragged trees, devoid of all their finery, stood on the fringes of either side of the road, in their immodest nakedness, a shame from which they could not hide, for their roots had been firmly anchored on the street for over 300 years, so bashfully, like the emperor with no clothes. They will blush self-consciously until the spring gleefully arrives, and once again, graciously their boughs will be resplendently bedecked with the modest finery of fresh green leaves. It would seem autumn had been swift this year, as if it had all but been a fleeting memory, as even the meteorologists were predicting that it would be an icy winter with bountiful snow that would bury our street and our cars under its thick glistening white carpets. Winter was a time of year when visitors that flocked to Lake Michigan would abandon our town in droves, like flocks of navigating birds looking for sunnier destinations where they could escape the wrath of a punishing winter that knew not the meaning of the word mercy. I can see a team of kids walking up and down the street, bouncing a ball and chatting jubilantly among themselves, apparently oblivious to the piercing cold fingers of winter, and an uncongenial wind that whips up their hair like a feisty blow-dryer. A crow on the corner of the road is dining out on a carcass of a rabbit, while little birds have found someone's leftover burger bun, tossed in a roadside drain, and are hungrily digging into it with an ardent zeal. Things get desperate at this time of year, and animals forage for what they can find. I'm wearing my pleated pants, cotton shirt, and black bow tie on this bodeful day where the sky simply refuses to wear a more cheerful ensemble, setting the tone for the bleak days that lie ahead, of which there would be many like this. I was glancing out of the expansive glass windows of the coffee shop where I worked as a waiter, and general all-round dog's body, of which I was not spared some of the less dignified, rather grim jobs, like cleaning up the disgusting toilets and wiping down unfortunate sticky spillages from clumsy, ungainly customers who visited our coffee shop. The sprawling main street consisted of a long ribbon of houses and shops on either side of the asphalt road, mixed together like old friends, many of them 1950s houses that had been converted into businesses, shops and bakeries. The coffee shop where I worked overlooked a house on the opposite side of the street that belonged to the town psychologist, or shrink if you like. Some preferred to call him that. whose unassuming white house with blue shutters was like a beehive of buzzing activity all day long, from 9 to 5, which made me poignantly aware that I was not the only person with problems in this world. It would seem there are many of us. How bad were some people's personal issues if they had to seek out the help of people like Dr. Geoffrey Munro? Imagine getting paid to listen to people telling you what was really irking them underneath the deceptively calm veneer that they might present to the world. Did people like Dr. Munro have a bird's eye view of really what was going on in people's heads? Their secret lives, so to speak. That was when I saw her. I do not know why she grabbed my attention, but she did, with the same kind of wow factor you might get if a mountain lion enters your field of vision. She was pretty enough, but that wasn't the reason I was drawn to her. It was something else. I watched her in her black and white checked overcoat, opening the doors of the 1950s home over the road, where Dr. Munro would see his patients. I suspected she was a patient, and contemplated what it was that she would be sharing with the psychologist. For a brief moment, I almost wished I could be a fly on the wall, to listen in to their conversation. I imagined her sitting on a soft leather reclining chair, spilling out her guts to a man who gets his kicks listening to people's grievances. I was staring out of the window like a gormless idiot who had been struck by lightning and was momentarily stunned. All at once I felt Mrs. Rodriguez's hands on my shirt, tugging me away from the window. "What are you staring at, Scott? I don't pay you to stare out of the window all day long. Now get a move on, will you? There's work to be done. Tables that need to be wiped down. Floors that need to be swept. And the couple at table number 7 are still waiting for their coffees, and you haven't taken their orders yet. Honestly, I rue the day that psychologist moved over the road from us. Everyone wants to gawk at the man's patience. What is it about people who come in here to snoop, to find out who in their town is a head case, so that they can have a good old gossip? It's scandalous if you ask me. People can't keep their noses out of other people's businesses because their own lives are so dreadfully boring." Was she pointing a finger at me, I wondered? Did she think I was a prying snoop? I nodded, my face blushing as red as a field of poppies. "Sorry, Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, snapping into action. I knew better than to rub her up the wrong way. Let's just say, as annoyingly pedantic and punctilious as Mrs. Rodriguez was, she had been a godsend to my life, for her wages had kept the roof over me and my father's heads, which was nothing to be sneezed at. Granted, the money she paid me was mediocre, but I'd rather work like this than get Social Security handouts from the government any day of the week, for I valued my independence. My mother had abandoned our lives when I was about 7 years old. Of course, I knew the real reason why she left, all those years ago. She had left a note behind for my father which read, "Sorry, I just can't do this anymore. I'm not cut out to be a mother." I knew growing up I'd infuriated my mother. In truth, I was the reason she had left our home. She had made her feelings clearly apparent in that note she had left my dad. I was the thorn in her side. I had always been a highly strung, timorous and painfully shy child, certain that there were monsters lurking under my bed, that were waiting to pounce on me and gobble me up for breakfast. My father worked night shift as a guard for some large office warehouses that contained valuables that needed protecting by nightly patrols. I would run over to my mother, grabbing her, clutching onto her for dear life, while tears streamed down my little face. "There's a monster under my bed, Mummy. It wants to eat me up," I'd wail. "I'm scared, Mummy. Please can I sleep with you?" "For God's sake, Scott," my mother would grumble, "go to your bedroom right now. It's the middle of the night. I'm trying to get some sleep. Can't you get it into your thick head? There are no such thing as monsters. Now stop being such a big baby. And no, you may not share my bed with me." My mother offered me no sympathy. I was too afraid to return to my bed, so I would lay down on the floor in the hallway to sleep next to the old grandfather clock that offered me some comfort. I felt safe next to that grandfather clock. Its clicking mechanisms made me feel that it was alive, watching over me like a walnut matriarch. My father, when he returned home from work, would find me lying fast asleep on a cold floor in the hallway, He was more than a little mortified by this. My parents would naturally argue, and usually any disagreements between the both of them would centre around me. I was always the root cause of their problems. If I was plucked away from their lives, the problems would go away. If my mother nursed any regrets in life, it was almost certainly giving birth to me. I had been a fortuitous accident that none of my parents had expected.
Be reasonable, Hilda, for goodness sake. Our son is only 7 years old,
my father had said gingerly.
Were you not afraid of the dark when you were only 7? Give the boy a break, will you? I found Scott asleep in the hallway. He could have caught his death of cold. You should have tucked him into bed. That's what a good, responsible mother would do. But not you. No, that was too much to ask, was it not? All you care about is your own creature comforts, Hilda. But it's not natural, nor is it normal for a mother to be so indifferent towards her own son, like you are. You're the problem. Our son is an innocent young boy, but you are his mother.
Oh, for goodness sake, Adam, listen to yourself. You've no idea what I go through every night when you're working night shift. Scott clings to me like a limpet. That boy is afraid of his own shadow. It drives me completely insane. I'm not good with kids, never have been. I told you that when we got married. You were the one who wanted a child, not me. But I rue the day when he was born. I'm sorry, but it's true. I wish I could turn that clock back, because I would do things so differently. I would ensure that he was never, ever born.
You don't mean that, sweetheart. Scott is young. He won't be so needy when he gets older. He'll grow out of fearing the dark. I promise you that.
My mother never hung around long enough to find out if I ever did get over my dreadful hang-ups about the monsters that lay in wait for me under my bed. When my mother left home, my father continued to wear his wedding ring on his finger, in the vain hope that my mother would one day come back. He dated most of the available women in town, but that wedding ring resolutely never left his finger. I often wondered what those women he dated thought of a man clinging so desperately to his past, refusing to let it go. I don't think it amused them in the least. My father never managed to develop any meaningful relationships with women, beyond some pitiful, rather pathetic one-night stands that left him slipping into a deep depression, for as he would tell me, meaningless encounters with women like that left him feeling frayed at the edges, for they cared not for him, and any physical interaction with someone who didn't care a toss about you was a vacuously hollow experience. My father hankered on to the hope that one day my mother would return home, walk through our front door and say she'd made a dreadful mistake by leaving us. But his illusory, fanciful dream never came to pass. When I was older, my father began to drink and was no longer capable of maintaining a 9-to-5 job. I had abandoned a college scholarship in order to take care of my father, which was why I was working at the coffee shop, against the advice of some of my well-meaning teachers, who thought staying with my father was pure folly. But they didn't understand. No one understood. Indeed, I think the whole town felt sorry for me, as all my friends went to college, and I was the one left behind, sweeping up the coffee shop floor for a living. And that, many people thought, was completely crazy. Don't throw your future away, Scott, for your drunken father. This is your life. You have so much potential. You could really make something of yourself. Who knows, your leaving home could be the kick in the teeth your father needs to finally get his act together and pull his socks up. That's what my teachers would tell me. I stayed here in town because I had a fierce loyalty to my father, especially after my mother had abandoned us. For it was my father who'd been the one to pick the pieces up of our lives, the one to assure me that there were no monsters lying in wait for me under my bed, the one who was always there to put a band-aid on my grazes when I took an unfortunate tumble, or to give me a glass of warm milk and cookies before I went to sleep, the one who'd been faithfully by my side through thick and through thin. Loyalty like that is invaluable. It is something you can never ever forget. It's priceless. Now it was my turn to return the favour. I owed my father big time for holding the fort up for so long. It was only in the last couple of years that my father, like a flagging tent in the wilderness, had begun to crumple under the harrowing effects of a lost hope. In my father's case, I think when he came to the realization that my mother was never going to return home, that was finally when the scaffolding that had held his dreams in place had come crashing down like the wall tiles that fall away from a crumbling grout. On several occasions my father had nearly burnt the house down by leaving chip pans smoking away on a gas hob and forgetting all about them. It had been a close call, with the house so nearly catching alight. My father was a danger unto himself, a liability. I decided from thenceforth I would take care of him, managing the bills, cooking the meals. Nothing fancy, usually something out of a tin that could be easily heated up, like spaghetti hoops, chicken nuggets, frozen pizza. That was the least I could do for him, when he had sacrificed so much on my account. In truth, the wrecking ball that had demolished our lives without apology had been my self-centred mother. I despised her for what she'd done to us, and all these years later she hadn't even bothered to call us once. I often thought, when I glanced out of the coffee shop window towards the psychologist's office on the opposite side of the street, that me and my father were probably two people who could well do with Dr. Munro's services, as in our own ways we both had big issues. We could possibly both do with a much-needed listening ear to give us a sense of perspective over our lives. So often I felt as if I was navigating my way through quicksand, and I unequivocally perceived my father felt much the same way, as although he never expressed such thoughts, we were like two peas in a pod in that regard, firmly locking away our feelings in a box in our mind, throwing away the key so no one could break into our iron-cast safe of vulnerability. As a young man, I was shy and unassuming, and only ever had one girlfriend in my life, when I was about 16 years old. I just wasn't good with girls. I'd clam up like an oyster in a shell, and become incredibly self-effacing and reserved. If the girl was attractive, it was 1,000 times worse for me. I was not socially articulate or fluent like some of my friends, which was something I deeply regretted and willed to change if given the chance. I was sweeping the linoleum floor when the girl that had caught my attention over the road, after visiting Dr. Munro's office, entered the coffee shop. The bell tingled, and Mrs. Rodriguez guided her to a lonely table and took her order. Our coffee shop was purged of all its customers that had long since left, who would be back the following morning. Everything about our coffee shop at this time of the year was mundanely predictable. The same faces, the same orders, the same monotonous conversations, in the same monotone voices that would predictably ramble on about the weather. "Too dreadful," they'd say. "They're predicting snow this winter, yet again, and lots of it too. I mean, look at that gloomy sky. I think we're going to have it bad this season." The mysterious girl, whoever she was, did not appear to be predictable. She was like an unexpected, fortuitous arrival on Groundhog Day that signified the fragrant whisper and pleasing bouquet of change, for there was nothing nondescript about her. Yet she was ordinary and unexceptional all the same, and yet at the same time she wasn't. This was an enigmatic woman who had got me by the short and curlies, as I couldn't figure her out at all, like a mathematical conundrum that you simply cannot decipher. If I were a bee, it would be her can of fizzy-cola I'd be buzzing over. The girl had ordered a ham and tomato sandwich and a vanilla latte. She sat there staring out of the window, her eyes pinned fiercely on Dr. Munro's office, with a wistful, longing kind of look on her face. The shops in town had closed early in the late afternoon. The quirky little gift shop over the road that sold the cheesy little greeting cards, fluffy toys, fridge magnets, and cheap little medallions with slogans like "World's Best Mother" on them and "Dad, You Rock," had closed their doors, as had the ladies' boutique, whose fashion displays in the window looked more frumpy rather than elegant, offering size XXXXX many times over. Some of those tops could easily fit 10 bodies rolled into one. We should have closed up shop already, but the only person keeping us waiting was the young woman who was drinking her latte, rarely late in the afternoon. She was still staring out of the window vacantly, obliviously unaware that Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting in the wings for her to pay her bill and finally leave the premises so we could close up. The late afternoon looked grim. The sky a gunmetal grey colour. Some street lights, sensing the growing greyness on their sensory mechanisms, had finally switched on, so that their lights could subdue the approaching darkness that would soon descend over our small town. Mrs. Rodriguez had told me that I could go, which was rather good of her. I think you better make tracks, Scott, before it gets dark. I'll see our last customer out.
If you're sure, Mrs. Rodriguez, I said, stifling a yawn. I mean, that's very kind of you.
I was exhausted, as running around a coffee shop all day, attending to the demands of customers, was very taxing. Of course I'm sure, Scott. You're a hard worker. Even I know you need a break. It can be punishing running on your feet all day after all my customers. Now off with you. I slipped gratefully into my hooded sweatshirt and my puffy overcoat, and then I pushed open the glass doors of the coffee shop. The invigorating November air greeted me with its icy kisses. I slipped my hands into my pockets to keep them tucked away from the cold. The whole town was marinated in the mute whispers of a soundless silence, with only one or two cars interrupting the solitude when they swept past me on the long grey ribbon of asphalt. The trees on either side of the street, devoid of leaves, moved their boughs in the breeze, while the lights of shops and houses twinkled like Christmas lights through the veil of grey that was slowly descending across town like a tenebrific mist. That was when I saw the girl again. She brushed past me hurriedly down Main Street, her hands buried into her fleece-lined pockets, her colourful scarf floating around her neck in the wind, while her long brown hair was tucked safely under a red woolly hat. She didn't notice me as I ambled down the street, but I was compelled to follow her, as if this strange woman had procured some bewitching hold over me. There was something about her that intrigued me, with the same kind of mystifying allure that attracts moths to light. I kept a safe, very discreet distance behind the girl, so she didn't know I was following her. Why was I following her? Even I didn't know the answer to that enigmatic question. I was walking in the opposite direction to my home, but follow her I most certainly did, with a magnetic pull that I simply could not overcome. She passed the carousel and moved steadily towards the beach. The lake pounded against the washed-out colour of the sandy shore. It is only during the lighter hours of the day that I would appreciatively observe the whitecaps arresting the sand like a charging cavalry of white knights. But at this time of the late afternoon, the lake seemed ominously still, almost too still, as if basking in the solitude of this lonely late afternoon. My sneakers padded over the soft contours of the sand, some of it wilfully sticking to the soles of my shoes. I trudged past patches of stone-washed grass, bleached by the hostile cold weather, vanquished of all its former viridescence, for the winter's savage austere grip on the landscape is never kind, never merciful, far from sympathetic. I can see a man on the pier, looking out over the waterfront views, with an expression of wondrous awe on his face. Perhaps he's not from around here. I think I can understand his reflective revelry, as under the sinking light of the late afternoon, everything looks magnificent, washed under the mesmerizing golden glaze of a dipping sun that pirouettes so elegantly over the landscape, dappling the water in a linear streamer of glittering gold. The young lady I had followed seems equally as enchanted by the view, as much as the man who has now left. I can hear his car finally whizzing out of the parking lot. She stares over the water as though transfixed. She's definitely not from around here, I decide. It is usually strangers who stand in awe of the views that locals so easily take for granted. I hastily retreat to the shadows so the woman cannot see me. I don't want her to see me, lest she should think I'm some kind of creep, or worse still, a dreadful pervert. I'm neither of those things. I meander towards a wooden island decked out with picnic tables and chairs that overlooks the beach. I sit on a chair and stare out towards the lake, my eyes focused on the young woman 40 feet away. She sinks into the sand with her legs close to her chest and stares out towards the water as if caught up in a meditational stance, where her mind is soaring up into the sky with the gulls, but her body left far behind. What the girl does next astounds me. I told you there was something very unusual about her. She pulls off her black and white jacket, throwing it onto the sand as if it's surplus to requirements, Are you kidding me? What the hell is she doing? My heart freezes as I watch the woman disrobe. There is nothing seductive about this unveiling. She blows all caution to the wind with the recklessness of a toddler attempting to swim without its armbands. One by one, boots, socks, sweater, and finally her jeans lie in puddles on the sand. The young woman runs into the water without any hesitancy, only wearing her underpants and a light flimsy vest. Are you kidding me? Am I really seeing what I'm beholding right now? Does she remotely comprehend how cold the water is? The icy wind thrashes against her face audaciously, but she doesn't seem to care about that. And when the temperature of the lake is below 40 degrees, it surely threatens hypothermia. But she seems to embrace the cold. I stand there as dumb as a dodo, almost as if I've been stunned by 1,000 volts of electricity, and am totally incapable of rationalizing any thoughts. I find myself wondering if this woman, who moments before was unloading her problems with Dr. Munro, has now decided to call it quits on her life, and this is the way she wants to end it all. Because life has got too much for her. Will I be the witness to her very last moment? Should I call for help, I wonder, dipping into my pocket for a cell phone that I realise is not charged? Just my luck. Why the hell did I forget to charge it? I watch in confoundment. The woman swims in the lake, diving beneath its depths, until I cannot see her any longer. Oh my God, where has she got to? My heart thunders violently against my chest cavity, while chills of impending dread prickle my spine. But the woman rises again, with the grace of a dolphin against the waves. Then her body, now blue with cold, dashes out of the water to retrieve her heaped pile of clothes lying spilled haphazardly over the sandy shore. Finally she gets dressed. Perhaps she wasn't planning to take her life after all. But who would willingly choose to swim in an icy lake at this god-awful time of year? No one normal. Perhaps she really is a head case. Is that why she's seeing Dr. Munro? Because she has big issues with her life? Yet despite all these poignant considerations, this woman who first grabbed my attention is still managing to hold my thoughts like no other, and try as I might, I simply cannot get her out of my mind. I retreat back to my home, where doubtlessly I will find my father, parked in front of a television set, knocking back tons of beers, as he becomes slowly more and more bladdered. Luckily he's not a bad drunk, but there's something so soul-destroying about seeing someone you love slowly slipping away from you, like the sands in an hourglass. For sooner or later, without any doubt, his liver is going to pack up like a car engine that has seen better days, and that will be the end of my father and his very, very sad life. Try as I might to not think about the woman, she keeps reappearing into my thoughts. I wonder if I'll ever see her again. The thought of not seeing her again makes me suddenly feel quite sad. It is early in the morning that I briefly glance out of the kitchen window that overlooks views onto the street, the tall lofty oak trees, the residential houses. Our kitchen has a bird's eye view of the creepy-looking abandoned house over the road from us, the house that is the talk of the town, with a morbid reputation and a more than ambiguous history. I'm preparing coffee and toast to line my stomach sufficiently before I return to the coffee shop. Another day at the grindstone. I was looking out of the window to gauge the temperature outside, so that I would dress appropriately for work. Would I need another jacket, I wondered. As I suspected, the sky was grey as ever, with that overcast, lugubrious look which assures you the day will be cold, windy and grey. Nothing new. And that is when I see the young woman again, that had beguiled my fancy, stolen my interest, and wormed her way into my heart like a caterpillar in an apple. I notice she is squeezing out of the window of the abandoned house. The house in our neighbourhood, with its illustrious reputation for being haunted, made worse by the woodgrove that fringes the backyards of those properties, and stretches back for many miles. I could see that the window of the abandoned house had been cleared free of all of its glass, and I realised the young girl must have broken into that property. She was not the first, nor would she be the last to do that. I watch her barrelling down the road, with her large canvas bag thrust over her shoulder,
What the hell was she doing, I thought. Please, God, she wasn't going for another cold swim in those treacherous waters at this hour of the morning. The very thought made me shiver with cold. The house over the road had been abandoned for years and years. It now belonged to the bank, but I think the bank obviously thought the demolition costs were way too expensive, so it had sat there like a lonely old spinster, with peeling paint, withered windows, and a sorrowful look, growing more and more desolate every single year, even bleaker than the icy cold weather itself. The front yard was overgrown, with weeds tangled amidst the grass, and ivy crawling around the outside walls. The house's sinister appearance and haunted reputation that preceded it had not put off squatters from moving into the place, but unlike most properties, where its illegal occupants would lay down semi-permanent roots, the squatters over the road would come and go like hibernating squirrels. They'd never stay for very long, so maybe there was a smidgen of truth to those ghostly rumours. It was the following evening that I noticed the light of the abandoned house switching on and off, and that was when I realised that the girl was probably back, and thoughts of her stuck in that freezing house did not sit comfortably with me. Why did I care so much about this strange girl? I wanted to go over to the house with a blanket and some food to offer her. I wanted to help this young woman. But wouldn't it be presumptuous of me to interfere? Some people didn't appreciate perfect strangers poking their noses into their lives, where they didn't belong. My father was sitting at the table, with a relaxed expression written on his face. He was happily tucking into the oven-ready chicken nuggets and chips I'd prepared for him. He was not as drunk as usual, but then again the night was still young, holding seductively in its hand the guileful promise of drunken opportunities to be engaged that my father would never refuse. He invited beer into our home, like a long-lost beloved friend that you haven't seen in years, a friend you held in high regard and never wanted to leave. My father would always tremble if he hadn't had enough to drink, but once he'd been through a stash of beers, the trembling would subside. He looked green at the gills this evening, but that was not something new for him. It's funny how alcohol can destroy the radiance of your complexion, rob you of your robust health, destroy your cognitive abilities, and age you like nothing I know. My father, with his corrugated fine skin, looked older than his natural age, 60 going on 80. Suffice to say, I was the one that gave my father an allowance for his beers, for without that allowance he would likely spend everything we own to raise money to support his habit, and giving him an allowance nipped the problem in the bud. It was the better of two evils. "Why do you keep staring out of the kitchen window?" he asked me, waving around a chicken nugget at the end of his fork, rather precariously. It looked suspiciously like it might do a somersault and land on the linoleum floor in a messy splutter. "Are there more squatters over the road again? More of them moved in, are they?" "Something like that," I said grimly. "It beats me," he said, shaking his head dismissively, "why anyone would ever want to live in that god-awful house." "Everyone in town says it's haunted," I told him. "You do know what happened there?" my father asked me, popping a chicken nugget into his mouth. "Quite the story it was." "I've heard rumours about the place, but no, I don't know what happened there. I was very young at the time." "By Jove, I think you're right about that," said my father, wiping away the crumbs from his moustache and taking a large swig of beer from his can. Let's see. Yes, you were about 6 at the time when it happened." "What happened?" I prodded, my curiosity aroused. "When the young boy living over the road hung himself in the closet. I think he was about 15 years old." "You're kidding," I gasped. "It wasn't pretty," said my father. "That poor family, what they must have been through. It's a tragic story. Turns out the boy was being bullied at school. He was so miserable. He took his own life. The family living over the road were good people, you know, but they fell apart after their son died. It shredded their relationship. They blamed themselves for not realizing that their son was so unhappy at school. They slipped into a deep depression, as you can imagine. I believe the lady of the house couldn't get out of bed in the morning, while her husband began to shoot up with drugs to escape his desolation, a little like me with a drink. Things spiraled out of control. The couple lost their jobs. The bank repossessed the house. And ever since then, the house has remained unoccupied. The bank failed to sell the place, given that no buyers wanted to buy a house where a young boy had hung himself. Mud sticks, you see. That's understandable, I said. I speculated. Do you think the rumours of the house over the road being haunted are true, Dad? I asked him. No idea, son. You know what small towns are like. Every town has its haunted house. I guess the house opposite fits the bill or profile rather nicely, does it not? With its insidiously gruesome past. Then there's a woodgrove behind all the properties in the back there. Never been in there myself, but let's just say over the years I've heard ominous stories about the place being haunted. I think even if they're not true, people are predisposed to believing them. Not Mr. Parker, I told my father. He says he takes his dogs into those woods regularly. He says the woods are benign, perfectly lovely, and all the haunted rumours are just idle conjecture from some of the locals who get their kicks from scaring people half to death or enjoy stirring up trouble. After my father's confession about a young boy hanging himself in a closet in the abandoned house over the road, I worried all the more about the young lady who was now squatting there. Why was she even there, I wondered? Surely she got cold and hungry. She was staying in an abandoned house with a devastatingly tragic history behind it. Did she even know about the house's reputation? I've never been very confident with women, but something magnetic was pulling me to do the right thing by her. So there I was with my blanket in my hand, a few snacks, and a torch that I carried in my hands, crossing over to the other side of the road, making my way towards the abandoned house. The night was fiercely cold, as a wind whipped against my skin, and the trees on our road thrashed their naked boughs up and down like a seesaw. I walked through the tangled, very bleached but stiff grass of the front yard, ambling over towards the open window that had been blocked on the inside with merely a piece of flimsy cardboard to keep out the cold, and given that it hadn't been taped up from the inside, it was doing a meagre job in subduing the elements. I pushed the cardboard away from the window, crawling through the space, finding myself standing up on a very old kitchen counter, where the tiled surfaces were crumbling away from the grout. And that was when I saw her. She was lying on the floor, with a cushion from the old settee being used as a pillow, and she covered herself with a flimsy, threadbare blanket that was filled with holes. The place smelt musty and damp, with the faint smell of cigarette smoke that offensively impregnated the air, that seemed to have seeped into the bedraggled furnishings and frayed curtains that were yellowing with age. When she saw me standing there, with a blanket and a paper bag in my hand, she looked very scared. I hadn't considered that my presence might scare the woman half to death. She sat up, her eyes wide, clutching the blanket tightly to her chest, her body trembling with terror, her face white. The room was lit up by a single lamp. It was strange that after all these years, the house still had electricity. "Who are you?" she said, stammering. "Who are you?" "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. My name is Scott. I live over the road. I noticed you were squatting here in the abandoned house. I was worried you might be cold. I brought you a blanket," I said shyly, handing it over to the young woman, who took it reluctantly. "I made you a couple of sandwiches, in case you're hungry," I said, handing her a paper bag. The young woman's brown eyes brightened. "That's so kind. I don't know what to say," she said, taking the blanket from me and the bag of sandwiches. "My name is Lucy. Lucy Palmer." "Pretty name. It's freezing in here, isn't it? I could bring you an electric heater if you like." "Are you really this nice to all the squatters that come here? I would imagine most townsfolk would find them to be a menace. But not you," she said, studying me curiously. "You don't work for the Salvation Army, do you?" she teased. "Anyone can see you're not a menace. Where are you from?" I asked her. "Oh, you know," she said vaguely, not wanting to answer my direct question. "I'm just passing through." She opened my sandwich bag
with a great deal of enthusiasm, I thought, pulling out a sandwich and inspecting it closely. "Ham and cheese! My absolute favourite! How do you know?" "Oh, my word! I recognise you! I knew I'd seen you before. You're that waiter from the coffee shop in town. You took my order the other day." I grinned bashfully. "You've got me there. I concede that based on your recent order at the coffee shop, a little birdie told me you had a taste for ham and cheese sandwiches. I saw you going into Dr. Munro's office," I said suddenly, realising I'd gone far too far. This was not the right thing to bring up with a perfect stranger. I must sound like a real busybody. Now this girl will probably tell me to mind my own business. But to my surprise, she didn't. The girl's jaw tightened. She stared at me as she ate her sandwich, chewing it slowly. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked. "It's kind of lonely in here. I would rather appreciate the company." I nodded. "Why not? I have to apologise for mentioning your visit to Dr. Munro. I don't know what came over me there. It's none of my business. I'm not normally so abrupt or presumptuous. The words just popped out of my mouth without any filter," I said apologetically, folding my legs onto the oakwood floor that was well past its best, as many of the floorboards were warped from being exposed to the damp, from some hairline fractures in the roof, I should imagine. "Well, I wouldn't call you nosy. I'd say you were observant." "Well, it's difficult not to notice you. But what are you really doing here, if you don't mind my asking? Why are you visiting an expensive psychologist when you're squatting here? It makes no sense at all. Oh dear, there I go again, putting my nose into your personal business where it's clearly not wanted." The girl chewed her sandwich, studied me, as if deciding whether she could trust me or not. "You really want to know why I'm visiting Dr. Munro?" "Well, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I realise I'm crossing the boundaries of your private life." "Dr. Munro is my father," she said, her eyes misting over with tears. "Only he doesn't know it." "How can he not know that he's your father?" "My mother met him in Florida. They had a holiday romance 18 years ago. Then she never saw him again after that. I came along 9 months later. She never told me who my real father was, but I found out his name when she knocked back way too much alcohol and finally let the cat out of the bag. I know he's married with a family, so I've got 3 half-siblings, all brothers. If my mother knew I'd come here all the way from Florida to seek him out, she would literally do her nut. She thinks it's for the best to let sleeping dogs lie, and to let Dr. Munro remain completely oblivious to my existence. But she's wrong about that, you know. Don't I have a right to know who my biological father is? And doesn't he have a right to know about me?" "So let me get this right. You're saying Dr. Munro doesn't even know you exist. He doesn't even know he has a daughter." "Something like that," she says, shrugging her shoulders. "I've been using all my savings to pay for the therapy sessions in order to meet him. Dr. Munro thinks I'm suffering from the bereavement of losing a brother that never actually existed, just so that I can receive counselling from him. That's why I have no money. Those therapy sessions cost an absolute fortune. My mother thinks I'm staying with a friend, but I came here to look for my father. But now," she says, stammering, "I'm too scared to tell him who I actually am. I thought I'd be able to do it, but I just can't. I can't. I've completely lost my nerve. I'm probably going to have to return home to Florida with my tail between my legs, and my father none the wiser that he has another daughter." "It can't be easy, especially when you don't know how Dr. Munro will react to your news. But from what I've heard, he's a very good man. I'm sure he might be terribly pleased to learn he has a daughter, even if it does come as a bolt out of the blue for him." "You think so?" asked Lucy, her eyes hopeful. "Oh, I hope you're right. I can't stay here for very much longer. I can't sleep at night in this god-awful, desolate place. It freaks me out. In truth, I'm so glad you're here. It's quite scary on your lonesome in a place like this." She lowered her voice into a whisper. "There's something ominous about this house. I don't know what it is. I can't put a finger on it exactly, but it has a very sad, mournful, lugubrious energy about it. Sometimes I just want to cry for no reason at all, but the emotions aren't actually my own. It's like I'm feeling the total despair of somebody else who lived in this house once. I have a profound sense that something really bad happened here. I've always been sensitive and intuitive like that. I decided it would be wise not to tell Lucy about the boy who'd been found hanging in the closet all those years ago, and his two grief-stricken parents, who had been ruthlessly kicked out of the house by the bank when they couldn't pay off their mortgage repayments. Some stories were best not shared. "Look, I better go," I said. "My father will be worrying about me." I knew that wasn't true. My father would probably not even know that I wasn't at home, but I needed an excuse to leave. "I would invite you to stay at our home, but it would be awkward. My father has issues with alcohol." Lucy held up her hand. "You don't have to explain. I understand. You've been so terribly kind." "Look, I would tell Dr. Munro if I was you, that you are his daughter. Do you have another session with him in the morning?" "Yes, I do. Tomorrow is the last one. Well, the last one I can afford. Then I go back to Florida. So I either tell him tomorrow, or that's it." "I think you should tell him. I really do. If I was wearing his shoes, I would want to know if I had a daughter. But then again, that's me. I never did have a big family, so what I do have is precious to me." "Thanks for that. You've given me some food for thought." I wiggled out of the window of the abandoned house, my feet dropping onto the grass below, and that was when I heard the scream. It sounded like a woman was being murdered, and it was coming from the woodgrove at the back of the property. I don't mind admitting that it scared the living bejesus out of me. Lucy was leaning out of the window, looking at me, her face growing as white as a sheet. "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" she asked me. I nodded. "What the hell is it?" "Wait there," said Lucy, returning to the window with a fire poker in her hand, which she handed over to me, along with a spare torch, although I already had one in my pocket. "A woman is being attacked in the woods. We have to help her," she said, wiggling outside the window to join me. She was wearing her black and white coat and a sensible pair of sneakers on her feet. "My guess is it's the husband or the boyfriend. It's always someone you know. He lured her into the woods, and he's about to kill her. That's why she's screaming. We have to help her." Lucy told me this with such conviction, as if she had no doubt in her mind that this was what was going on in the woodgrove. I almost believed her. It does sound like a woman was being attacked, and possibly even murdered. If the truth be told, I'd have sooner gone straight back home to my comfortable bed and pretended I'd never heard the apocalyptic screams. Lucy was looking at me as if I was some kind of gallant knight, which I have to say flattered me immeasurably. No one had ever looked at me like that before, as if I was like a super-duper lion-hearted hero that could right the wrongs of the world. I couldn't allow her impression of me to be dulled or deflated. I could feel the ego inside me pumping up like a beach ball, and it felt good, really, really good. It made me feel important, courageous, heroic. I wanted to live up to Lucy's misguided impressions of me. I wanted to be that superhero. The pretentious, inauspicious screaming from the woods persisted. It really did sound as if a young woman was being attacked and murdered, and the sound was desperate, like an urgent cry for help, coming from someone moments away from losing their life. I'd never ever been in the woods at the back of the property before, not even in the daylight hours. I promptly reminded myself that Mr. Parker said the woodgrove was benign, and that all the rumours about the place being haunted were unfounded. "You know, Scott," he had told me, "I don't know where those rumours come from. My guess it's old Mrs. Fisher. She's been making up these stories. You know what that dreadful woman's like. She's the local gas bag, with a nose as long as Pinocchio's. If there was anything wrong with these woods, I would be the first to know about it. My dogs are highly intuitive, and they would sense something was off. But they love chasing the rabbits in there, and having a fabulous time. I think folk around here are missing out an awful lot, not exploring the woods. But there you go.
People around here are a tad too superstitious. The forest is exquisite, with all those silvery trunks, pretty leaves, all the light that peeks through the canopy, that dapples the forest floor. So sinister the wood grove is certainly not. But you know people. They'll believe anything. They think I'm quite mad taking my dogs for a walk in the grove. But they're the ones that are missing out.
"Hurry up," said Lucy, giving me a push. "Someone is in trouble. We have to help them. A woman is being attacked, possibly murdered. We haven't got any time to lose. We can't just stand here dawdling. We've got to help her and scare off her attacker. You can knock him out with the iron poker. Knock him hard. I can see you're very strong. I know you can do it." The last thing I wanted to do was to enter the wood grove, but Lucy was right. Someone was being attacked. There was no doubt about it in my mind. The beguiling woodland grove of trees that I'd failed to explore all my life, owing to the unfounded, putative and haunting rumours that had kept me the hell away from the place, the hair-raising ghostly tales that had circulated robustly around town, at the efficacious speed of light, without apology, had almost certainly burst my confidence like a bubble. Suffice to say, many of the locals claimed they didn't believe the spine-chilling tales that abounded, but in their vehement protestations, their actions spoke much louder than words. For it did not escape my attention that these so-called mocking naysayers, who were dismissive of such conjecture, were the very same people who pointingly never visited the woodgrove themselves. So their vacillating reluctance was most illuminative as far as I was concerned. My heart thundered against my rib-cage as I hightailed it through the paper birch trees in the woodgrove, down the long earthen woodland trails, with Lucy running at my side. This girl could run without even gasping for breath. She was in excellent shape, but then you would expect her to be, tackling the icy cold waters of Lake Michigan in November. The 40-foot trees, with their long, spindly, lanky stems, pierced the tenebrific skyline with a lofty, rather grandiose deportment, their white bark obscured by the inky darkness. The pearly moon had grown somewhat bashful, and had timorously slipped behind some cloud cover. The looming dark shadows hauntingly danced through the trees. Our jeans chafed against vegetation and ferns that were not discernible to the eyes, in a dusky twilight that had audaciously stolen all the light away. The stout-hearted trees shook their naked boughs that had long since abandoned their leaves, so that their gangly long limbs in certain lights looked like ungainly claws. It was cold as the icy grip of an oncoming winter imprudently pierced through bone, marrow and sinew. The venturesome wind punched us with Arctic-like gusts as we moved towards the screams. I've never heard such ear-piercing screams before, that sent the fear of God running through my veins. I'm not courageous by any manner of means. I've always been the kind of person to avoid confrontation of any kind. And yet as we ebbed ever closer towards those creatures that could easily shatter your eardrums, I had a profound sense of prognostication, that I was going to have to face my fears head-on, and that was a bodeful feeling that offered me no comfort from my growing sense of unease, that rattled my bones like an old skeleton, and sent cold chills running up and down my arms, so that the tiny little hairs stood up on edge. I'd never beaten up anyone in my life before, not even on a school playground as a boy. I knew that tonight I was going to need to punch the lights out of a man who had dragged a terrified woman, kicking and screaming, into the bowels of the woods, and was in the process of tormenting her, with his end goal in mind, to murder her. Maybe he'd even bury her here in the woods, and then the rumours about the woods in the future would grow exponentially, even more ominous. Me and Lucy clandestinely hid behind a tree to discern what was going on. We needed to work out an artful, fail-safe strategy of how to proceed in what seemed like a treacherously dangerous situation that could potentially threaten our very own lives. That was if anything were to go wrong. There is no telling what a murderous villain is capable of when caught up in the savagery of his wrathful revenge. I had to consider all the red warning flags. In what way was this man attacking this poor woman? With a poker, a revolver,
a baseball bat, a knife. Of course, I knew you never run head first into a situation without first promptly deciding how to proceed, as you need to know what you're up against. I certainly didn't want to put my own life in danger, even for a young girl who'd stolen my fancy and warmed the cockles of my heart. Nor did I want to subject her to any danger, which meant we needed to proceed very cautiously. The moon shed her former reticence like an old skin, and her pearly luminescence sparkled through the forest and lit up the silhouettes of the 4 human-like shapes we could see. These were not regular people. They were Bigfoots. There was no doubt about this in my mind, although until this point I had thought Bigfoot was just a mythical creature of legend. But the luminescent light of the pearly moon illuminated the silhouettes of the pyramid-shaped heads, the overlong arms, the humongous-sized bodies, covered in long, flowing dark hair, blacker than coal. I drew in a deep breath and held it in, as if I was diving under the water. My heart pounded violently in my ears, not from fear, but from the absurdity of what I was actually perceiving. My attention was drawn to the screamer, a female Bigfoot, about 5 foot tall, with an immature energy about her, which made me perceive she was still a youngster. She was behaving like a precocious little brat that was not getting her way. It would seem her brother, only marginally taller than she was, had something in his hands that she clearly wanted. It was like she was screaming, "Give it back to me! It's mine, not yours!" It was like watching 2 kids fighting over their toys. The 2 Bigfoot parents, that were easily 9 foot tall, watched their daughter having a temper tantrum, as if her idiosyncratic behaviour was nothing new. I'm sure they must have felt exasperated with her, as any parent ultimately would. The screaming female Bigfoot turned her attention to her father, hoping to get him on side, but he seemed unamused. He began to speak to her in a reprimanding, stern tone of voice, in an ancient language, while his female partner, the mother, nodded in agreement. Whatever it was the male Bigfoot was saying, it appeared to silence the screaming Bigfoot, who hung her head in shame, as if he'd given her a real telling off. The male Bigfoot walked over to his son, demanding him to give whatever it was he was holding in his hands, which he obediently relinquished into his father's hands. It looked to be a bird's nest. All those frantic screams in the woods were all about a little bird's nest. The male Bigfoot threw the bird's nest at a tree yards away from where we were hiding, as if to say, "Now you have nothing to fight about. Neither of you are going to have a bird's nest." The young female Bigfoot dashed towards the fallen bird's nest, trying to gather it up with her hands, but some of the eggs it had contained had broken and were lying smashed on the forest floor. The Bigfoot looked anguished as her sad face examined the broken eggs. She desperately tried to salvage the nest. I could swear her little brother was laughing at her as she grappled along the ground, looking for any eggs that might have rolled under the shrubbery that was still possibly intact. I felt desperately sorry for this Bigfoot all of a sudden. She seemed so attached to this nest. It seemed to mean so much to her. Both of her parents were engaging in earnest conversation, their backs turned away from their daughter. As the Bigfoot grabbed the nest, only inches away from where I was standing, she saw me. She looked up at me in surprise. I think she was so bewildered to see me that she wasn't exactly sure how to react. Her dark eyes met mine. At first she seemed quite scared. I was worried she was going to scream again. Then I did something that even surprised me. I hurriedly went over to her and helped her pick up the pieces of the scattered bird nest, and I helped her look for any eggs that might still be salvageable. I managed to retrieve 3 little eggs that were still together. I handed them to her. Her dark eyes lit up like a Christmas tree, and she squealed with delight. The most extraordinary thing happened. The Bigfoot spoke to me in my head telepathically, and I heard the words clearly. "It was my bird's nest. My brother stole it from me. He always takes my things, not because he wants them, but because it makes me upset. He enjoys making me upset. He enjoys winding me up." I was very glad to see that both mother, father, and son were no longer looking in our direction. They appeared to be studying something in their hands and talking to each other excitedly. It looked like an old dog collar with diamante diamonds set in it. Then I remember Mr. Parker complained that his dog had lost her beautiful collar in the woods.
The Bigfoot with her nest in hand gave me a happy nod and then went forward to join her family. Me and Lucy watched the family, still talking excitedly among themselves, backwards and forwards, in a foreign language, the likes of such I have never heard before. I had no doubt they were talking about the collar with its glittering stones. After a while they turned around and drifted away into the woods. "Oh my God," said Lucy, as we headed back to the abandoned house. "Even if I never get to tell my father that I'm his daughter, coming here all the way from Florida has been worth my while. We have just seen a whole family of Bigfoot. The little girl was sweet, wasn't she? But by God, she could scream like nothing I know. At home we call Bigfoot the skunk ape because they smell really bad. But these Bigfoot didn't smell at all, did they? I've never seen one before, but I always believed they existed. Sometimes you just know things. My mother says it's because I'm an intuitive. And when you're intuitive, you just get feelings about things that turn out to be usually right."
"Well, that doesn't really surprise me. Not when you consider that the bayou and the marshy wetlands can be stinky. Somehow I think anyone living among gators and snakes would stink, don't you? No matter who you are."
"Never thought of it like that, actually, but you do make a good point." The following morning, when I returned to work at the local coffee shop, all I could think about was the Bigfoots I'd seen the previous night. If it wasn't for that unusual girl in town called Lucy, I'd never have had that extraordinary encounter. I knew she was special. I'd picked that up from the very start. I would have turned a blind eye to those screams that I'd heard last night, but a little self-indulgent vanity had enabled me to face my fears and go after a man who might just have been bludgeoning a woman to death for all I knew. I had behaved in a way so incongruous to my non-confrontational nature. As a result, I'd encountered a family of Bigfoot. I felt so privileged to have had such a remarkable experience, which I shared with an incredible woman, and it had serendipitously brought us together. I felt so drawn to Lucy. I needed to help her. In some strange way, this newly acquired spate of courage was rubbing off on me in a positive light. Maybe I wasn't such a shrinking violet after all. It would seem I was finally coming out of my shell, after years of a lingering reticence that had consumed my life like a raging wildfire, and had left my relationships with women severely stunted. For the first time in years, I had held my own, in a long conversation with a young woman I rarely fancied, and what's more, talking to her had been as effortless as breathing. Lucy had trusted me enough to tell me the real reason she had arrived in our small town. I felt honoured and privileged that she had chosen to confide in me. In my morning coffee break at work, after a busy early morning trade, I found myself crossing the asphalt road and walking towards the 1950s house with its blue shutters, the premises of Dr. Munro. Not for a teensy moment did I engage in a vacillating hesitancy about what I was about to do. Instead, I confidently pushed open the glass door of the psychologist's office. A woman was sitting in the reception area. I'd seen her around town before. She had the appearance of a snapping turtle, as she eyed me dubiously through her wary, hooded eyes. Everything about this woman was stiff and unyielding. Her dark hair had been pinned away tightly from her face. She had neat, pearly studs in her ears, and only a suggestion of coral lipstick brushing her lips that was so faint it was barely discernible. "Yes," she barked. "Have you got an appointment with Dr. Munro or not?" Her tone was brusque.
"No, I haven't, but I do need to see him. It's a matter of the utmost importance. I can't stress that enough."
"That's what they always say," she says, raising a cynical brow.
"No, I'm being serious. It's very important that I see Mr. Munro. Dr. Munro, right now."
The woman's thin lips turned into an upside-down smile. "I'm sorry, young man, but you have to do things by the book, just like everybody else does. You're not exemplary or special in any way in that regard. If you want to make an appointment with Dr. Munro, you need to schedule one yourself. You can't just turn up out of the blue and expect to see him. Dr. Munro is a very busy man."
"I realise that. I've seen how busy he is myself. I work at the coffee shop over the road, but this is a personal issue. I simply must see him."
A personal issue, she said scathingly. A suspicious glimmer prickled in her brown eyes. Her eyes skimmed over my black tie, down to my shiny shoes. What do you mean by personal? Could you explain yourself, young man? Look, are you going to let me see him or not? I need to tell him something of extreme importance. I can't tell you any more than that. It's personal. The woman sighed, lifting up the receiver. I'll see what I can do. Dr. Munro, I'm so sorry to trouble you. I have a young man with me in reception. He claims he needs to see you concerning a very important personal issue. No, he won't tell me what it's about. He says it's incredibly important and will only take up a minute of your time. He's very insistent. He needs to see you. That's right. She nodded. You can go through. It's the first door on your right. Dr. Munro was sitting at his grandiose walnut desk. His well-appointed office boasted a long leather recliner that looked so comfortable. It was possibly for his clients, who could lie back on that chair and just talk. There was a bowl of freshly cut roses on the table, and an essential oil diffuser filled the office with a pleasing scent of neroli. It was the kind of office clearly designed to put people at ease. Take a seat, said Dr. Munro, pointing to an upholstered green leather chair, tucked on the opposite side of the desk. I understand you have something you need to tell me. I tremble as I study the doctor, but he does seem to be a very nice man. I don't really know how I'm going to let the cat out of the bag without bringing claws and screams, but this man looks so stoically composed. I doubt anything could actually ruffle his feathers. Do you remember a holiday you had, sir, on a Florida beach about 18 or so years ago? Daytona Beach, to be exact. You met a young girl on the beach called Marjorie. You had a holiday romance with that girl, but after you parted company, you never saw her again. That was a long time ago, young man, said Dr. Munro. Let's see. Yes, I do remember a romantic holiday romance with a very lovely young girl called Marjorie. What is this about? You have a client visiting you here, a young girl called Lucy. She's been receiving therapy from you in your offices. What about her? Asked Dr. Munro, stiffening. I am not privy to talk about my client's cases. I hope you can understand that, young man. Lucy has been visiting you under false pretenses. She does not have a deceased brother. She is your daughter. Sorry, young man. I didn't get what you were saying. Do you mind repeating yourself? Say that again. Marjorie was pregnant after you parted ways. She was pregnant with your baby. Lucy is your daughter. She came to look for you, but she hasn't got the guts to tell you who she is. So I thought I would do it for her, as a go-between. I have a daughter. Lucy is my daughter, asked Dr. Munro. He broke into a broad smile. Goodness gracious, she looks just like Marjorie did. I knew she looked familiar. My wife will be pleased. I have 3 sons, you know. We've never been able to have a daughter. I don't know what to say. This is incredible. It's taken me quite by surprise, but it's not a bad surprise at all. It's just going to take time to get used to, but I'm very excited about getting to know Lucy better. To cut a long story short, which is what I'll have to do, otherwise my story will become an entire book, and short stories need to be constrained within a limited amount of words, so I won't beat around the bush. But the young girl I met in the abandoned house is now my wife. We have 2 children, and Dr. Munro and his family are now close family to us, and they welcomed Lucy into their lives with open arms. She was thrilled to gain some brothers, and Dr. Munro and his wife were over the moon to have a daughter. It didn't seem to matter to Mrs. Munro that her husband had sired a daughter with another woman. Dr. Munro was so incredibly grateful to me for telling me about his daughter that he gave both me and my father personal counselling for our issues, me over my mother, and my father with his issues over his wife that had left him so long ago. Thanks to Dr. Munro's help, my father went to AA and got completely sober. He's now happily married to a woman called Vivian, and he's hopelessly in love with her. I was able to go to college and get a degree, so everything worked out in the end. I do confess, after encountering the Bigfoots in the woods, my life changed exponentially for the better in so many ways. I'm glad to say that these days the wood grove behind the houses in our street is actively explored by ramblers, some who claim to have had fleeting sightings of Bigfoot. The abandoned house and its history was brought to its knees, and a new Cape Cod-style house stands in its place. I've never heard from my birth mother again, but a woman who wouldn't get rid of the monsters under the bed of a 5-year-old kid, in my mind, is not worth fretting over. That's what I say. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the double-storey red-bricked houses on the street were all alike, boasting red walls, double-hung sash windows, and grey slate roofs. The classical houses boasted an architecture with a timeless appeal. They had been new additions to this neighbourhood, not too far from the town of Whitmore in South Carolina, over 30 long years ago. At that time, the local area had been heavily fringed by sprawling wood groves, many that had since been bulldozed to make way for more housing developments. This illustrious neighbourhood was up and coming, even 30 years ago, where fabulous trees planted on either side of the street were merely inconspicuous saplings, but over the years they had miraculously transformed themselves into lofty, towering oaks that dappled the street in a pleasing shade. The neighbourhood had grown more beautiful in recent years, as the yards had matured and the trees grown exponentially. Also, with time, the red-bricked houses had lost that new look. The bright red bricks had faded to a more mellow red colour, and the houses, having been occupied for 30 years, now contained in their walls the memories of lives well lived. And so they too had gained a history, which gave them an aura of mystery and intrigue. As with the advancing of age comes a beauty that a brand new house can never replicate, try as it might. For indeed, an empty book with no written pages can never hold your attention, nor can it prickle your emotions. It fails to be interesting. But a house that has held the souls of people within its very bowels will contain within its walls a kaleidoscope of colourful secrets, and the residents at number 53 had a secret to tell, and an interesting one at that. It all began 30 long years ago, when Scarlett Everdeen and her husband Mason had purchased number 53. Suffice to say, buying a house had been a great deal to Scarlett. She was determined to raise her family in an exquisite environment, and these red-bricked houses held the potential of so much promise. "I just love it," she'd said to her husband when they'd first laid their eyes on number 53. "But can we really afford it? I mean, we're first-time property buyers, aren't we? And the price is so steep." Her husband, on seeing the animated look on his wife's face, as her eyes remained longingly fixed on the house, with the same kind of attachment as a little girl would have, holding a baby puppy in her hands that she wants to keep. That was the kind of look on Scarlett's face, and there was no way that Mason could refuse his wife's dreams. It would have taken a brave man to say no to her. He was determined that, come what may, he could afford the house, even though his pockets were shallow. But where there's a will, there is always a way. Somehow he would make it happen for Scarlett, for he loved nothing better than to see his wife smile. "Of course we can afford it," he had insisted. Against all the odds, Mason had managed to find the kind of job that could give his wife Scarlett the life she'd always dreamed of. They were by no means wealthy, but how much do you really need in life if you have a good home, a nice car, and a reasonable amount of money in the bank? Then life can be very good indeed. Excess wealth was like having too many baked beans stashed away in the store cupboard that long after you've gone, someone else will get to enjoy. Scarlett had not had an easy childhood by any manner of means, but she was determined that the future for her family was going to be a bright and rosy one. Little did she know that when her children were in their teens, that someone would be silently waiting in the wings, loitering around with the stealth of a black panther, watching her every move and waiting to pounce on her when she least suspected it, and this would be the kind of enemy that you never saw coming. Little did Scarlett know, someone held in their heart such a burning hatred for her that, like a malignant, cruel cancer, was beginning to grow and grow and grow, and would eventually get out of control. And then all hell would break loose, and the life she loved so dearly might be ripped away from her like a ladder in a pair of tights. But sometimes fate has other ideas in mind that can end up surprising us all. It all began shortly after old Mrs. Petra Stewart had died. She had been a delightful old dear, and one of those people like a perennial flower seemed to emerge after an icy cold winter, brighter than ever before, and on true seasonal form. She would always leave town in the colder months of the year, to return to South Carolina in spring, like a cheerful bush of colourful pink peonies. Nobody in town knew where she went for the winter months, and most did not care to ask, for fear of being intrusively rude or prying. They hoped she would volunteer the information for herself, and tell them about her exotic adventure or summer location, perhaps on a fabulous cruise somewhere. But she never did. She was the kind of person you just thought would live for ever and ever and ever, just like the tenacious rosebush you had in your yard for years and years, that awakens in the summer in a blaze of fabulous colour that you never imagined for a single moment might not be around any more. That was the way the townsfolk felt about Petra Stewart. She was reassuring, a constant, like the oak trees that fringed the pavement, that were always reliably there. In the last 10 years, since Scarlett had known Petra, the old woman had not changed at all. She looked old for sure, but always exactly the same. Her corrugated face beset with a road map of wrinkles, and loose jowls that hung under her chin, like a turkey's neck. But they never deepened as you might expect, nor did they get any saggier. Instead, she stayed exactly the same, with no noticeable gradual deterioration that you often find in older people. Some that shrink, and sometimes even shrivel up like an old potato, but not Petra, never Petra. She was immune to that physical decline. Scarlett thought it might have been due to her zealous and robust passion for life, and the fact that she claimed that she still felt she was 21. "I might look old, dear," she would say, "but I don't feel any different to how I felt when I was 25 years old." She would peer at Scarlett through her wizened blue eyes, that in certain lights became a silvery grey. She would say, "How are you, dear?" in her sing-song little voice when she greeted Scarlett every morning from over the white wicker fence. "I'm fine," Scarlett would say, "absolutely fine." It would seem that Petra was slight of frame, but robustly strong for one so old. Petra would be quick to point out that age was only a number, and you were only as old as you feel. "It's a state of mind, dear," she'd say. "If you think you're about to pop your clogs, then you most certainly will. I've seen it with many of my older friends, you know." Every morning, as regular as clockwork, Petra could be found doing some odd jobs in her yard, and she would industriously buzz around with as much industrious vigour as the bees and butterflies that pollinated her flowers. That old woman had energy beyond her years, and was not afraid of genuine hard work that younger generations would be quick to shun. Let's just say that Petra's yard was the pride of the neighbourhood, for that woman had green fingers that were the envy of all the townsfolk. Once Scarlett had dropped off some of her dying pot plants to hand over to her elderly neighbour, in the hope that she could resurrect her beleaguered plants from their grim impending fate. And Petra had returned her plants to her with bountiful glossy foliage and a plethora of flowers. Scarlett had clandestinely thought that Petra must have a fabulous magic wand somewhere around, that she secretly cast over her plants, as they were the healthiest and most vibrant specimens in the entire neighbourhood. One glance at the cottage-style flowers that burst through the flower beds of her front lawn, where a tangle of daisies, delphiniums, larkspurs, zinnias, and so many other colourful blooms would pop through the earth in a perfect symmetry, and would make you realise that this organised chaos was created by a master gardener,
who made her masterpieces look effortless. Scarlett knew that anyone who was a master at their craft made things look so easy, like a proficient diver or a phenomenal adept athlete, that made their skilled accomplishments seem so seamless. But no one knows how many hours are devoted to create such polished synchronicity. Petra had spent many long hours in her yard, creating the quintessential perfect Garden of Eden that had inspired many of the admiring locals to visit her yard, to admire her dazzling floral displays. Petra was dearly loved by the local community, but one morning the 90-year-old woman did not seem to be bobbing her head over the white wicker fence to greet Scarlett with her usual big smile, which sounded warning bells for Scarlett, who knew at once that something was terribly wrong, and decided to check up on her friend Petra Stewart. It was Scarlett who found Petra lying on the bottom of the staircase with a packet of dianthus seeds in her hands. She had broken her neck and had died whilst doing something she loved to do. It seemed symbolic, her dying with a packet of seeds in her hands, almost reminiscent of the whole life and death cycle. Soon after Petra had died, her red-bricked house was put up for sale and was snapped up on the very day it was on show by an eager, enthusiastic buyer, a single woman of about similar age to Scarlett, with the name Constance Cunningham. It would seem that come hell or high water, nothing would stop Constance from buying this house. There is something about living in a small town that makes people interested in their neighbours, and Scarlett was not immune to this curiosity. She was eager to see who this woman was who had demanded to buy the house next door. Word on the grapevine from the estate agent's nephew is the woman gave his uncle a sizable cheque, or if one is being less polite, a backhander or bribe, as an incentive to ensure he put off all other home buyers from buying the property so she could have first refusal. Let's just say with a yard like Petra's, eager buyers were champing at the bit to purchase the place. To give Constance her due, she had paid the full asking price for the property, but with so many interested parties on the wings, the price could so easily have climbed steadily onwards and upwards, acquiring a sizable profit. Scarlett rightly assumed the new owner of number 54 must be quite a pushy, self-assured person who knew how to manipulate people to their own advantage, a shrewd woman who didn't suffer fools gladly. These were characteristics so alien to someone as noble, polite, and honourable as Scarlett. She couldn't resist peering through the curtains to have a good old gawk at her new neighbour. "I'm not being nosy," she told herself. "I'm just being interested. There's nothing wrong with showing a healthy interest in your environment." The sage green removal van was parked outside the house next door, but there was a rather disappointing showing of furniture that was being evacuated from the rear of the van by two hefty-looking men. Much of the stuff that the van unveiled had clearly seen happier days, and looked like it had been bought at a yard sale. It was peculiar for the furniture to be so tattered and forlorn, for someone moving into such a prestigious neighbourhood. Maybe this woman had scraped the barrel to buy the beautiful house next door, but didn't have enough surplus cash to splash out on furnishings. Or perhaps she was a miserly penny pincher who didn't like to spend her money and bought everything she owned from thrift stores and yard sales, and spent her entire life dumpster diving to cut down on supermarket bills. Scarlett observed all the pitiful-looking furniture that emerged from the back of the van. She noticed an old dresser made from cheap-looking plywood, a kitchen table that looked like it had been used for kids' paint classes, and a sorry-looking set of faded settee furniture that had been badly bleached by the sun. It was moments later that she laid her eyes on the new neighbour for the very first time. The woman had a gaunt, emaciated-looking face, a pointed jaw, a beaked nose, with deep-set dark eyes that seemed almost cold, hard, calculating. The woman was unnaturally thin. She reminded Scarlett of a bundle of chopsticks covered in crepe paper, but her posture was straight, and she walked gracefully, with a determined gait. She was wearing a pair of black slacks, sensible pumps, and a white cotton shirt. When she talked to the large burly man, who was bringing in the cheap-looking feather-light furniture into the house, her manner seemed brusque, even a wee bit condescending, as if she had a superior attitude.
I don't like her, thought Scarlett in disappointment. I don't like her sad-looking furniture, and I don't like her. Scarlett did not usually judge anyone on first impressions. She was the first to know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. But there was something about Constance Cunningham that irked her and gave her the chills. Let's just say her former neighbourly, magnanimous thoughts of dropping over to the house with a casserole and a bottle of wine to welcome Constance Cunningham to the neighbourhood were put on the back burner, as Scarlett decided she didn't want to meet this woman, and avoidance of this new neighbour would be a worthwhile strategy to endorse. But living in a small town, sooner or later they were bound to cross paths, especially with the woman living next door to her. Why couldn't she have moved somewhere else, Scarlett thought. And furthermore, why did old Mrs. Petra Stewart have to die? Constance Cunningham had moved into the red-bricked house at long last. She had her eyes fixed on this house for years, but when the old bat seemed to refuse to die, she had stealthily snuck into that house through the back kitchen window, which had been a tight squeeze, but Constance being so skinny, she could literally climb through any small opening that she wanted to. That would make most people come unstuck. She had clandestinely laid in wait for the old lady, like a cougar hiding out on a tree, waiting to pounce on its unsuspecting victim. She had stealthily hidden in a closet upstairs that stank to high heaven of mothballs and lavender. It had been so claustrophobic in that confined space that she thought she was going to give herself away by sneezing loudly, as the insufferable taste of those god-awful mothballs was now sticking to the back of her throat. If she wasn't careful, she could end up dying prematurely from mothball asphyxiation, she had thought. She had heard Petra Stewart muttering away to herself, something about some seedlings she wanted to plant. Anyone could see the silly old dear was fixated over her yard. Constance had watched her year after year, month after month, spending copious amounts of time in the yard, singing away happily to herself. On one occasion, she had been so desperate for the old woman to die, she'd slipped some insect repellent into the milk on the doorstep, which had turned bright blue. No doubt the old woman had never drunk it, more's the shame. She knew what she was to do next. That would be foolproof. No one would ever suspect an old woman falling to her death from a staircase to be remotely suspicious. I mean, the woman was 90, for goodness sake. Everyone would expect her to die at some point, would they not? The locals in town would all just assume she had slipped down the staircase and had a nasty fall. It had been so much easier than she ever envisaged possible. Constance had discreetly tiptoed behind Petra as the shuffling, ungainly woman descended the staircase, failing to hear her stealth-like approach. Petra had cautiously snailed her way down that staircase with her seeds in her left hand, while clutching the staircase railing with her right hand. Constance crept behind the woman, pushed her hard, and for a moment she had been airborne. Then her body had crashed on the parquet floor with a mighty thud, and Constance had heard a strange snapping sound. Finally, when she examined the old woman lying on the floor, her eyes glazed over, mouth open, and body lying at a peculiar angle, she was satisfied that at long last the old bat was dead. "I've done her a favour," she told herself. "I've put her out of her misery, like an old cat or dog that has been euthanized by the vet." Constance had stealthily slipped out of Petra's house like a cat burglar and crawled under the fence to the rear of the property, taking a shortcut through the woods to the road beyond, where her car lay in wait for her. She was feeling victorious. Now she would wait patiently for number 54 to come on the market, and bingo, she'd be living in the house next to the woman she'd been waiting to avenge for so many years. Scarlett Everdeen had ruined her life. Now it was payback time. Life could be a bitch, and Scarlett was about to find out all about that. And revenge was a dish best served cold. But she would bide her time, strike when the iron was hot and the moment was ripe. Constance had one thing going for her. She had lots of time on her hands and plenty of patience. Constance thought back with annoyance about all the wasted years she had spent in a mental hospital, thanks to Doris Riley. That woman had been determined to have her institutionalized. Thank God she was finally out of the way, and much like Petra Stewart's death, No one had suspected a single thing. She had fiddled with Doris's brakes, and the woman had been unable to stop her car in time and had ploughed head first into a truck when she had gone whirling through a red light. Constance had observed the whole accident, following Doris's car behind at a safe distance. She had watched it all, the ambulance arriving on the scene, strapping Doris onto a gurney and covering her head with a blanket. The EMTs were shaking their heads sadly. She, on the other hand, had rubbed her hands with glee. 2 gone, just 1 to go, and then finally the depths of her wrath would be settled. The doctors at the psychiatric hospital had medicated her to the nines with a large cocktail of drugs that made her feel so sluggishly sleepy. There had been times when she'd been strapped to gurneys, injected with all measure of medications that would knock her out for many days. Sometimes she'd been callously locked up in a cell all on her own, as the doctors believed she posed a danger to herself and to the community. She'd been medicated with tranquilizers, antipsychotic drugs, tremor medications like stelazine and prolixin to calm down the violent side of her character. She had been diagnosed with intermittent violent disorder and schizophrenia, which she'd been told by her doctor meant that there was a breakdown between her thoughts, emotions and behaviour, giving her a faulty perception, inappropriate actions, a withdrawal from reality, mental fragmentation, fantasy and illusion. Those bloody doctors had no clue what they were talking about. Constance knew that there was nothing wrong with her, nothing at all. Thank God she'd been given the all clear to live a free life in society, provided she remained on her meds. Did they really think she was going to go through life feeling only half alive? They were sorely mistaken about that. Every month those pills were flushed down the toilet without apology. Never before had Scarlett felt so vibrant as she did now. Things were looking up in her life, and she was feeling exceedingly happy about that. But now, like a snake sensing the closeness of its prey on its tongue, she could feel that Scarlett, the victim of her wrath, was now in close proximity. There would be a measure of calm before the storm. She would wait for the perfect opportunity to destroy Scarlett's life, but she would bide her time. It was important that, like all the other fortuitous deaths she had so cunningly orchestrated, that no one suspected a thing. Scarlett. In the days that followed, Scarlett felt increasingly uneasy about the woman living next door to her. There was something so familiar about her, but she couldn't put a finger on it. Then she realized that the woman living next door to her was a dead ringer for her late sister Ella. That would explain why she'd experienced an instant dislike to the woman. It was those haunting dark eyes, the beaked nose, the angular chin, made all the worse by the woman's painful skinniness. She had remembered the relief she and her mother had felt when over 10 years ago they finally learnt that Ella was dead. Ostensibly, both mother and daughter had felt bad about celebrating Ella finally being gone, but that woman was a dangerous liability, and when a predator that has been a threat to you for so long is taken out of your midst, of course you're going to feel a great deal of relief. Doris had received the letter from the mental institution, along with the ashes of her daughter, which she and her mother had thrown over a pretty lake in South Carolina. The letter had read, "Dear Mrs. Riley, I'm sorry to inform you of the tragic passing of your beloved daughter, Ella Riley. I regret to inform you that on Tuesday last, your daughter was found hanging in her hospital cell. At the time, we did not believe she posed a suicide risk to herself. The medications had been managing her condition very favourably, and as we informed you, she was due to be released from our facility in a week's time. We had been delighted with her remarkable progress, and deemed her no longer a risk to herself, or anyone else for that matter. We were about to locate her into a halfway house facility, but that was sadly not to be. It seemed that your daughter's mental condition somehow relapsed, which has been known to happen. We are sorry to be the bearer of such bad tidings, but patients with these kinds of psychotic profiles are often likely to take their own lives. We were informed you had relinquished any desire to remain in contact with your daughter."
But given that your daughter is now deceased, we thought it appropriate, and we thought that it was reasonable that you might appreciate laying her ashes to rest. Once again, we are sorry for your loss. Yours sincerely, Dr. Trevor Finnegan.
Scarlett remembered how she and her mother had embraced, holding each other tightly on the linoleum floor of the kitchen, refusing to let each other go. Tears had trailed down her mother's cheeks. Now they knew with certainty that they would never have to live life glancing over their shoulders, worried that Ella would come after them to seek her revenge. Only a week before Ella's demise, they had received a notification from the mental hospital informing them that Ella was to be released into the community under close evaluation from her healthcare providers and would be taking up residence in a halfway home until the facility was confident enough to believe that Ella could be independent and manage her own medications, finally weaving herself back into society to live a normal life. Doris Riley had expressed her fear to her daughter. "You do know, if Ella finds us, she'll kill us both. I have no doubt about that in my mind. She told me as much. She said when she left the mental institution, she'd be after us and she'd kill us both." Scarlett had nodded. She knew her mother was right. Ella would stop at nothing to find them, if she ever got out of her confinement. That woman was clever, a masterful manipulator that could even persuade her own healthcare providers that she was fine when she was anything but. When Ella was born, she had become a precocious brat and an impossible unbridled child that was almost impossible to control and capable of so much destruction. Doris had found her putting a bag on the cat's head once when she was only 4 years old and hooting with laughter about it as the cat struggled to escape its lethal confinement. Doris had been mortified to see her child behaving like that and had promptly rehomed the cat, knowing in her heart her child could not be trusted around animals. Worse was still to come, when the fish in her fish tank were bludgeoned to death by Ella, who seemed to get great pleasure from killing anything she could get her hands on. Doris had found her daughter with an axe, standing gleefully on top of the kitchen countertops, hammering away at the fish, with an elated look on her face, inflicting not only damage on the fish themselves, but also on the kitchen sideboards that had to be replaced, as the axe had ripped them apart. When Scarlett was born, things got progressively worse. It would seem that Ella became insanely jealous of another child consuming her mother's attention, and at 5 years old, Doris had found her daughter standing over Scarlett's cot with a pillow in her hands. She was smothering Scarlett by pressing the pillow down on her daughter's face, very hard. When Doris saw what Ella was doing, her face had drained of all its colour. Her blood had boiled with rage. "What are you doing, Ella?" her mother had screamed, running over to Scarlett and tearing the pillow away from Ella's firm hold. Scarlett had gasped for air and had come so close to losing her life that day. "What the hell is wrong with you, Ella?" her mother had screamed. "You tried to kill Scarlett. You tried to kill my baby and your sister." The cold, dark eyes had turned around to look at her, with a vindictive smile on her face. "You're not right in the head, Ella," her mother had cried. "There is something seriously wrong with you. You need help, and me and your father will stop at nothing to get it for you. You cannot go around hurting your sister and innocent little animals. Normal people don't behave like that." It would seem that Scarlett's mother had stopped at nothing to try and get help from doctors and psychologists for her daughter, but no one would listen to her, as when they met Ella, she turned on the charm like the gas at a hob, seducing all the potential healthcare providers into believing that she was the quintessential perfect child that had been grossly misjudged by her parents, who had misunderstood her. To the doctor she'd say, "I'd never ever hurt my little sister. When my mummy saw me with my pillow, I was just putting it behind my sister's head. I'd never hurt her. I'm a good girl." The strangest thing of all is the doctors would believe her. People with PhDs behind their names, who had vast experience in child psychology, had fallen hook, line and sinker straight into Ella's guileful silken web. "Why, Mrs. Riley," her mother had been told over and over again, "I'm very pleased to inform you that I find nothing wrong with your daughter. You have quite the little charming girl there.
She passed all my psychological evaluations with flying colours. With the greatest of respect, Mrs. Riley, I think you've misunderstood your daughter. She's a clever girl, very intelligent. I don't think she intended to harm your little girl. It's easy for parents to become paranoid, to overreact. Maybe you took things out of context. Your daughter assured me she did not put a pillow over your daughter's face, and I believe her.
You don't understand, Doctor, Doris had piped indignantly. Ella is cunning. She's very bright, as you say, very eloquent, highly intelligent. She's deceived you into believing that she's normal, but I promise you she's anything but. If you lived under my roof, you would see what she's really like. It was when Ella was 14 that finally a top psychologist listened to Doris. Dr. Ralph McGregor was the top of his game. He hadn't fallen for Ella's manipulative cunning, but had seen right through it, and so Ella was finally institutionalized. In a trice it would seem her true nature was revealed to the staff, who had described her as highly dangerous. Indeed, Ella had been so violent she had attacked members of staff at the facility, bitten one of the staff members so hard that one of her own teeth had popped out of her mouth. Worse still, she had skillfully made sharp little knives from plastic cutlery, which she had used to stab one of the psychologists, whom had nearly died from the attack. So a benign, benevolent human being she certainly was not. After Ella was finally institutionalized, both Doris and her daughter continued to live in fear, dreading the day when the mental facility gave Ella the opportunity to return to normal life, under the supervision of mental health care workers. They knew Ella would be up to her old tricks again. She would deceive the doctors into believing that she had her life under control, and would persuade them that she could rigidly stick to her meds. That's all she really needed to do, and then she could be a free woman again. In the beginning, Mrs. Riley had visited her daughter at the mental hospital, but Ella had lashed out at her like a wild animal. "When I get out of here, Mother, I'll kill you, and then I'll kill Scarlett, and I'll watch you slowly die. But I will get you. I'll get out of here. You mark my words, I'll get out of here, and when I do, I will live up to my threat, and I will get you both," she had growled. And that was when Mrs. Riley had wiped her hands clean of her daughter. She had said to Scarlett, "Your sister is like an unbridled wild animal, whom is a danger to society, and most certainly to us. We can only hope that she will never get out of that place, because if she does, God help us." Scarlett tried to push away the memories of how tough her childhood had been, with the looming threat of her sister hanging over their lives like a ticking time bomb. As a little girl, she couldn't count the amount of times that Ella had pushed her, hit her, tried to submerge her under the water. Doris had tried to keep her eyes on Scarlett 24/7, but distractions always naturally arose, and when she locked up Ella in her bedroom to prevent her from doing any damage, the child became insufferable, insubordinate, and would have explosive tantrums that were so terrifying it was hardly a wonder that by the time Scarlett was 2 years old, their father had actually divorced Doris. He couldn't cope with living in a toxic environment with a child who was at best obnoxious, and at worst volatile and dangerous. When Scarlett's husband Geoffrey came into the kitchen, he observed his wife staring out at Petra's old house. She had her hands immersed under the soapy suds at the kitchen sink, and appeared to be locked in a strange trance, as if her mind was 1,000 miles away. He noticed she wasn't even washing the dishes. He knew his wife had been hit hard by Petra Stewart's death, but ever since the new lady had moved in next door, it hadn't escaped his attention that his wife had grown increasingly off-colour, and recently she had even snapped at their own children. She seemed to be a little on edge, and he meant to get to the bottom of his wife's incongruous, irrational behaviour. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, coming into the kitchen, planting a kiss on her cheeks. "Is everything all right? You seem a wee bit off colour. For the last few minutes your eyes have been fixed on Petra's old house. Are you still upset about the old woman's death?" "Of course I'm upset about losing Petra, but it's not that. Have you seen the woman that's moved in next door?" "No, I can't say I have."
She's a dead ringer for my late sister Ella." "Oh dear, that's not good. If she looks like your late sister, it's bound to unearth some horrifying memories for you. But you must remember, she can't hurt you now. Your sister's dead. You're perfectly safe. I'm sure the neighbour is a very nice woman, even if she is a doppelganger to your sister. That's the way it often is. People often look alike. It's the way the world works. What's her name, by the way? The next-door neighbour, I mean."
"Constance Cunningham."
"Well, what I'm trying to say to you, sweetheart, is just because she looks like your sister doesn't mean she's similar in character. Two apples might look exactly the same, but can taste remarkably different. Haven't you found that before?"
"That is true," Scarlett agreed, "when you put it like that."
"So you do appreciate, then, that maybe this Constance woman, who unfortunately bears a remarkable resemblance to Ella, is probably a very, very nice woman. You should give her a chance before judging her so unfairly. It's a pity for her that she looks like Ella, but that is hardly her fault."
"You're probably right. I know I should go around there and welcome her to the neighbourhood, but I can't bring myself to do it, based on the way she looks."
"I'm sure when you do finally meet her, sweetheart, you'll be pleasantly surprised."
"You think so?" asked Scarlett doubtfully.
"I certainly do," he said.
2 weeks later, it was late afternoon on a Tuesday, when Scarlett returned from the store, and was in the process of unloading all the shopping in the cupboards, with both of her teenage boys rummaging around through the bags to find some snacks for themselves. "Honestly, if you two boys keep snacking the way you do before dinner, you'll have no appetite left whatsoever. All the dietary guidelines tell you to have 3 meals a day and to avoid snacking in between."
"Relax, Mum, will you?"
said Laurie, opening a bag of salted peanuts, which she munched hungrily.
"When have we ever not been hungry? You know me. I could eat a horse most days of the week. Snacking isn't going to put me off dinner tonight. I can assure you of that."
"I don't know where it goes to," said Scarlett. "You two kids eat enough calories between the two of you to support an entire football team, and you're still so skinny. I don't understand it at all."
"It's because we're growing, Mum. By the way, what are we having for dinner tonight?"
"You ask me what we're having for dinner tonight with a mouthful of peanuts? Oh, you boys, honestly."
"The peanuts are hors d'oeuvres," said Spencer, who was also cheekily tucking into a packet of his own peanuts.
"I thought I'd make spaghetti and meatballs. How will that do you?"
"Sounds yummy, Mummy," said Spencer, pouring himself a long glass of milk, which left a white moustache over his lip. All of a sudden there was a loud knock at the front door.
"Who's that?" asked Scarlett. She glanced at the clock. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Who would be paying them a call this late? She trotted over to the door, and her heart almost missed a beat, when standing there in the doorway was Constance Cunningham, her new neighbour. This was the last person she wanted to meet. Scarlett found herself trembling when she met the woman's cold gaze. She was standing in the doorway, wearing a black cotton dress that floated above her skinny ankles and accentuated her very pronounced collarbone, which was highlighted still further by the curious pendant that she wore around her neck. The woman followed Scarlett's gaze and smiled. She picked up the pendant in her fingers. "This is my shark tooth medallion," she said proudly. "I've had it for years. I believe it brings me so much good luck. I never ever take it off." The woman stretched out a hand to shake Scarlett's. Scarlett noticed her icy grip. Very, very strong it was. "I'm Constance Cunningham, by the way, your new neighbour. I'm so sorry, I've been meaning to pop around to see how you are and to introduce myself, but I've been so dreadfully busy. You know how it is. I was wondering if you could be so kind as to spare me a cup of sugar. I'm making a peach cobbler tonight, and I've run out of ingredients." "Oh, of course," said Scarlett. "Please come in. I've only got back from the store, and as it happens, I do have a bag of sugar that you can have. I always buy extra, as I have 2 hungry boys always on the go." "That's most kind of you, dear, most kind. Aren't the people in this neighbourhood quite charming? Everyone has made me feel right at home." Where are you from? Asked Scarlett. Albuquerque, New Mexico. So what brings you to this part of the world? It's quite a change of scene, I should imagine. I have a friend who lives in these parts. And well, you know, I took a drive one evening and I saw the red-bricked houses on the street. And let's just say it was love at first sight. I knew I had to live here. You're not married?
Goodness gracious me, no. I'm an independent woman who desires a solo lifestyle. I don't need a man. I enjoy the quiet, peaceful life, you see. The woman glanced around Scarlett's house approvingly as Scarlett led her through to the kitchen. You've got very good taste, if you don't mind my saying so. Your furnishings are quite marvellous, really rather lavish. Who have we got here, she asks, as her eyes darted from Laurie to Spencer, who was still eating peanuts in the kitchen, and looked up curiously when their mother entered the kitchen, with a stranger following behind. These are my 2 hungry boys I was telling you about. They never have enough food. In truth, they eat us out of house and home all the time. I spend half my life at the grocer's replenishing the food stores, you know. I can have a huge container of ice cream in the freezer one day, and the next day it's completely finished. It's like my pantry has worms. This is Laurie, and this is Spencer. Boys, this is our new next-door neighbour, Constance Cunningham, who is living in Petra's old house. I'm so pleased to meet you, says Constance, reaching out to shake the boys' hands one by one. Let me guess, she says, pointing at Laurie. You're 14. How did you know? I'm tall for my age. Everybody thinks I'm much older than 14. Most think I'm 17. Just a hunch. And you, she said, looking at Spencer. 16, perhaps? You're good, said Spencer, grinning. Like my brother, I'm tall for my age. He pauses for a moment and then comes quickly to the point with the bluntness of a candid teenager. Is it true that you blackmailed the estate agent to sell you the house next door? I understand there were lots of interested buyers, 'cause let's not kid. Everyone wants to own Petra's yard. It's like having the Hanging Gardens of Babylon next door. That's what everybody says around here. Constance raises her brow. Something like that, she smiled. I mean, you have to be artfully persuasive if you want something, don't you? Otherwise someone might snatch it from right under your nose, and we can't have that, can we? You're right. With a yard like that, I knew I had a fight on my hands. So I dipped into my pocket and paid the estate agent a large incentive for his favour to smile down upon me favourably. And it most certainly did, I'm glad to say. That's cool, said Spencer, grinning. Really cool. That's what you call thinking outside of the box. Or being very sly, said Laurie, giving Constance a cheeky grin. He reaches out to examine the shark-tooth medallion on her neck. Is this what I think it is? He asks. A shark tooth? You're right on the money, dear. But this is not just an ordinary shark tooth. This is a shark tooth of a man-eater, responsible for eating 3 deep-sea fishermen. You're kidding. You're not winding me up, are you? Is that actually true? Oh, absolutely. The remains were discovered in the shark's body. He'd taken huge bites out of the 3 men. Their boat capsized out at sea. That's incredible. It is, isn't it? I consider it my lucky charm. I never take it off, not even when I have a bath. Scarlett handed a bag of sugar to Constance. That's for your peach cobbler, she said. Peach cobbler, said Laurie, his mouth hanging open. He looked like he was drooling, like a dog does over a bone. Yes, I'm making peach cobbler. I can bring you over some if you like. There'll be plenty left over, as it's only me that'll be eating it. You're kidding, said Laurie. That would be incredible. And as Constance had promised, the boys were supplied with a plethora of peach cobbler, along with other delicious desserts in the weeks that followed, so that the Everdeen kids thought that the arrival of Constance Cunningham, the woman who wore a shark tooth around her neck, to their green leafy neighbourhood, had been a gift from the gods. For many will tell you that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and the Everdeen kids, with their robustly healthy appetites, were no exception to this rule. Let's just say that even if Constance Cunningham was not blessed with green fingers, like her predecessor Petra Stewart had been, the woman could cook,
so the Everdeen family weren't at all surprised to learn that she was a skilled caterer by profession, cooking food for fabulous banquets and private parties, all who raved about the high quality of her food. Scarlett had once heard that you should always be suspicious of skinny cooks, and she secretly wondered how someone who turned out such calorie-dense food could look like they hadn't eaten a decent meal a day in their lives. She wondered privately if Constance was actually anorexic. Was she a secret feeder who got her kicks from fattening everybody else around her up, while she remained steadfastly skinny? Scarlett realized her husband was right. One should never ever judge a book by its cover. That was a short-sighted thing to do. In truth, Constance Cunningham, her very austere appearance, the sharp angles of her face, the skeletal shape of her body, and those dark, cold eyes were nothing like the real woman underneath. Constance was charming to a fault, and even Scarlett's former skepticism faded away like the blue dye in a pair of denim jeans. As days slipped into days, weeks melted into weeks, and the icy cold winter weather had been and gone, Constance Cunningham had become a much-loved member of the local community, warming the hearts of many of the people who didn't have a bad word to say about her. "That woman is an incredible surprise," said Mrs. Montague, one of the long-established residents in the street, who lived at number 57. "Let's not kid. When she moved in here, I had my extreme misgivings about her, especially when she wears a shark tooth around her neck, of a shark that's actually eaten 3 fishermen, which is quite an extraordinary story in itself. I mean, she looked so cold, rather like a shark, actually, very unapproachable, with her cold, angular features. And it doesn't do her appearance any favours being as skinny as a rake. But surprise, surprise, she's not that half bad, you know. It was those eyes of hers that scared me a little." "You're right about that," said Mavis Riley, who lived at number 62. "When I first met that woman, she gave me the heebie-jeebies, turned my blood as cold as ice, she did. But I've changed my mind about her, done a complete 180 if you like. Maybe Constance is one of those unfortunate people that looks rather like a dangerous dog that might just bite you, but when you get to know her, all she is a cuddly teddy bear underneath." Spring had burst forth with the confident ebullience of a puppy dog. Daffodils shyly peeked out of the ground, their yellow heads blushing under the soft, teasing caresses of a spring sunshine. The wood groves were ablaze with bluebells that carpeted the forest floor in a bedazzling blue ocean. The stone-washed grass that had been incarcerated by the iron cuffs of a punishing grim winter had finally been set free, and it looked as if someone had thrown a viridescent green dye over it, bringing it all back to abundant life. Then there were the dogwoods, the saucer magnolias that were asplash with spring blossom, while the once skeletal oaks, with their claw-like hands, had had their boughs softened and bedecked with a richly verdant upholstering of fresh new leaves. No one was happier to see the arrival of spring than Scarlett was. It was a beautiful arresting day in early May, when Scarlett's husband had taken their 2 kids on a surprise impromptu trip to New York City to observe the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, and a fabulous show that had been well advertised that both her children were eager to see. Scarlett had the day all to herself. She was looking forward to nightfall, when she and Constance would spend an evening together, enjoying a light meal and a bottle of wine. "Oh, my word," Constance had said, "if you're going to be all on your own, Sim, without the kids around, and without the hubby, why not pop over for a meal and some wine with me? We'll make it a girls' night in, shall we? We can watch a movie together." Little did Scarlett know that on such a seemingly auspicious evening she would be walking into a lion's den, and the time would be running out for her. It was at 7:30 that Scarlett made her way up to the polished white door of number 54. The yard was still magnificent, but not what it used to be. But that was to be expected, for without Petra, without her magical touch, it would likely soon sag under less nimble hands. It was bound to happen sooner or later. Scarlett had decided to wear black slacks and a cool cotton black top with flat sandals for the evening meal. She was a slender woman,
but whenever she hung around the gaunt, emaciated figure of Constance Cunningham, she actually felt like a beached whale. So the black would make her feel marginally smaller this evening, she thought. She stood at the front door with a bottle of wine in her hand and a gleeful smile on her face. She was looking forward to having a girls' night in. Constance stood in the doorway, greeting her with a warm smile. "It is so good to see you, dear. So very good. Do please come in. Isn't it going to be fun, just the two of us together, spending the evening, having a girls' night in?" "I've been looking forward to it all day. Something smells incredible," said Scarlett appreciatively. "I can smell cheese, something full-bodied like a stew of some kind, and then there's a cinnamon-like smell, apples perhaps." "Very impressive," said Constance. "You've got an excellent nose on you, Scarlett. For starters, we've got cheese soufflé, followed by lamb shank and mashed potato, and then that is going to be followed by apple pie with plenty of cream." "You're joking," said Scarlett, making an approving face. "Tell me something. Have I died and gone to heaven, Constance?" "Tonight, Scarlett dear, you may very well die, and you may go to heaven. Or then again, you might just go to hell, mightn't you? If the food isn't that good," she said, in a strange tone to her voice. "Since when have you made anything that I didn't enjoy, Constance? My kids think the sun shines out of your backside, with all the puddings you make them. How can you eat so much, I ask you, and be so terribly thin? That's what I want to know. What is your secret?" "Eat so much? Goodness gracious me, Scarlett. Where did you get that idea from? I might be a good cook, but I've never been a big eater, so that's why I stay so thin. I know I'm too thin. Everybody tells me so. But I don't have much of an appetite. You'd look great, Constance, if you put on a few pounds. 20 pounds would look fabulous on you," Scarlett admitted. The two women talked and laughed, and Scarlett found herself getting really rather tiddly. Constance didn't stop filling her glass up with wine. "No more, Constance, you've got to stop," she giggled. "I'll be floating back home at this rate if I get any more inebriated." "I tell you what," said Constance, her face lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Why don't we go for a walk in the woodgrove tonight? Wouldn't it be lovely? The night is spectacularly beautiful." "I'm not sure it's a good idea, Constance," said Scarlett. "I'm wobbly on my feet, after all that wine you've given me. And in truth, I'm a little intimidated by the dark. Ever since I was a little girl, I was freaked out about it. I always thought there were monsters out to get me." "Are you telling me that you've never been in the woodgrove at night in spring? You have no idea what you're missing out on, dear. There is nothing to beat it. Go on, be a sport. It'll be so much fun. After all the food we've eaten tonight, it'll be a good workout for us. A little exercise would do us both good. Go on, you know you want to. It's a bit nippy out, and I'm not sure I'm wearing the most practical shoes for walking. I can lend you a pair of my sneakers, and a sweater if you like. We have the same size feet, I think." Scarlett felt cornered. She could see Constance was very eager to go for a walk in the woodgrove, but after all that delicious food and wine that they'd enjoyed, the last thing she wanted to do was to take a walk. In truth, she'd have liked nothing better than to recline on the sofa back at home, with her ginger cat Marmalade wrapped up in her arms, purring profusely. She knew Constance had been good to her family over recent months. It would be churlish to refuse her eager request. So reluctantly she agreed to go for a walk. Constance was right. It was indeed a magnificent night. Granted, there was a distinct chill in the air, as breezy gusts of wind nibbled her cheeks and neck. But in a strange way the sluggish feeling brought on by way too much wine seemed to ebb away when they were out in the cool air. The moon was bright, gleefully happy that spring had finally arrived, and shone down on them with an ebullient smile, casting an ethereal shimmering glaze over the yard, while the bright stars, like newly polished diamonds, shone brilliantly from the firmament. She was sure she could see the constellations of Taurus, Leo, and Virgo, but she didn't know much about stars. When they got to the yard fence, the boundary that separated the forest from the backyard, both women climbed under the fence and ambled towards the large congregation of trees that seemed to welcome them. Their tall, lofty silhouettes were densely dark against the smouldering pewter-coloured sky. Both women carried flashlights in their hands as they ambled down the woodland trail, where the soft light of the moon danced through the canopy of the trees. "See, didn't I tell you it was a spectacular night? And this woodgrove is beautiful," said Constance enthusiastically. The woodgrove was invigorating. Scarlett would admit that. It certainly wiped the congested cobwebs of sleep away from her eyes. But even with the twinkling moonlight and the cheerful chorus of the frogs and crickets, Scarlett suddenly had a sense of foreboding, a sense that something was dreadfully wrong. It was a vacuously empty feeling, a hollow in the pit of her stomach that just would not go away. It left a bitter taste in her mouth. "I think we should go back," she said nervously. "I think we're very far from the house now. We should make tracks, don't you think?" Constance turned around and looked directly at Scarlett. Her gaze was intense, devoid of humour or any light. And even in the light of the torch, Scarlett discerned a tenebrific look in her friend's already very dark eyes. I mean, how dark did eyes actually get? And then, to her absolute horror, Constance whipped out a sharp blade from her back pocket and pointed it directly at Scarlett. This was not happening. This couldn't be real. No, it wasn't. What the hell was Constance doing? Was this some kind of warped party joke? And Constance was pretending to be the Grim Reaper. Of course that's what it was, but this was not funny. Scarlett's jaw dropped open. Was this some kind of warped party joke? But the knife didn't look like a stage prop. It looked like the real deal. "What are you doing, Constance? Don't wave a dangerous knife like that around. It's not funny." "Oh, Scarlett, dear. Little Scarlett. You really are not the brightest brick in the block, are you? All this time, and you still really have no idea who I actually am. Do you? I've lived next to you for months, befriended the folk in town, got close to your family, and you still have absolutely no idea who I actually am," said Constance, purring. "Who are you?" asked Scarlett, her face becoming sombre. "Scarlett, Scarlett, you mean you still haven't figured it out? I'm your sister Ella, of course. Who did you think I was? But no, you can't be. There's no way. Ella is dead. We received notification from the hospital. They sent us her ashes. She is dead. I was the one, Scarlett, who sent you that notification letter with the mental hospital letterhead to inform you of my tragic passing. And I also sent you an urn of ashes. That was easy enough to do. And you didn't even have the foresight to check those facts with the mental hospital. That would almost have certainly let the cat out of the bag for me. But you and Mother were so terribly dim, like two fused lights. Our mother had relinquished any desire to remain in touch with me. It was not difficult to get my first name changed. You can do that very easily. And that's what I did. And then I married a man soon after and got a new surname. And after the divorce, I kept the surname. It wasn't terribly difficult to have to do. But I don't understand. Of course you don't understand. As I keep telling you, Scarlett, you're not desperately bright, are you, dear? I'm sure the hospital informed you that I was being released from their charge, provided I stuck to my medication. But I deceived them by being the perfect model patient. So after spending time in a halfway house, I was deemed healthy enough to return into society. And I enrolled in a cookery course to procure a living for myself as a freelance caterer. Then I made it my mission to find you both. And it wasn't terribly hard. You made it very easy for me. First I found our mother. Now, it wasn't difficult to mess around with her brakes, and I sat back and watched her struggle to stop her car. I watched her car flying through a red light and going head-on into a very sizable truck. And that was the end of Mother, dear. You didn't kill our mother. Scarlett froze to the spot, tears streaming down her cheeks, as she studied the sharp knife in her sister's hands, wondering what she should do. How should she escape her sister's grasp? Then, of course, I knew I needed to find you. And I did. But that bloody woman wouldn't die. So I gave her a little encouraging push. And bingo, I was able to move in next door to you and to get right under your feet. And now that everyone knows me in the neighbourhood as a much-loved member of the local community, when I kill you tonight, the blame will not be laid at my door. You see, Scarlett, I've had it all nicely worked out. But why? Why do you want to kill me so much? I don't understand. I'm your sister. I'm your blood relative. You mean you don't even know, Scarlett? Oh dear, you are so dreadfully dim. When you came along, our mother only ever had eyes for you. You were her world on which her access rotated around. I didn't even count. I knew if you were out of the way, our mother might finally give me some much-needed attention. I deserved her full attention, which she refused to give me. So that's why you tried to smother me with a pillow when I was a little girl. Do you know, Constance, you're seriously sick in the head. If you wonder why Mum favoured me over you, then look at yourself. You were hurting animals. No normal person hurts animals, but you had no mercy. You were awful. You broke out into violent tantrums. Mum was terrified of you. You are sick in the head, Constance. You need help, and you should be back in that mental hospital. What I need, little Scarlett dear, is with me right now. And I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to slit your throat with this very sharp knife, and then I'm going to watch you bleed out, and then I'll leave you for the wild animals to enjoy. There's a pack of coyotes living in this wood grove, always on the scrounge. I've been leaving them meat here in the forest in this very place where you're standing tonight, and I will leave your body for them to devour tonight. And once again, your death will be deemed a dreadful tragedy. I will naturally tell everybody that you came for dinner with me, and mentioned you fancied a walk in the wood grove. I told you that that was a crazy, nonsensical idea, and persuaded you against it. But obviously you didn't listen. Instead of listening to my advice, you never returned home, because they found your bones scattered all over the place. They will know you were attacked by coyotes. So very sad. Very, very sad. Tragic, tragic. Your poor husband and your 2 children. They're going to be so distressed to lose their perfectly lovely mother. Don't worry, little Scarlett. I'll take care of them once you're gone. And your death will be quick, very quick, like it was for our mother and Petra. You won't know a thing, I promise you that. Constance lunges towards her sister, grabbing Scarlett by the arm so fiercely. Scarlett freezes to the spot. Her blood turns to ice. Her throat fills with a bitter bile, and she is overcome with a feeling of impending dread. She can almost smell and taste death on the air. "Let go of me, Constance! Let go of me!" she says, trying to shake off her sister's fearsome grip. "Let go of me! Please, please don't do this! I've got children! I've got a husband! They need me! Please, please, I'm begging you! Don't hurt me!" "Plead for your life," says Constance. "Go on, plead, Scarlett. I like hearing you cry your heart out. It's a very pleasant sound." "What's the point? You're going to do what you're going to do, aren't you? Just think about my family for a moment, Constance. Have a little mercy. The mercy that you failed to show to my mother and to Petra and to so many little animals. My boys, they need a mother. Are you really that vindictive that you deprive them of that?" "I needed a mother, little Scarlett. Have you forgotten that? But you took her away from me, did you not? By stealing her heart. She locked me away in a mental hospital because of you. You are to blame for that. I was locked away for years and years, and it's your fault."
Scarlett could feel the icy cold blade at her throat. She closed her eyes tightly. Her sister was holding her down with one arm, but she tried to wiggle her body out of her sister's fearsome hold. But try as she might, she could not escape her sister's formidable clutches. Constance's dark eyes burned with hatred, and Scarlett knew that her life would soon be over, like it had been for her mother and for Petra Stewart. "Any last words, Scarlett, for good time's sake?" "Please don't, Constance! Please don't! I beg you, my family need me." "I'm supposed to feel sorry for you, am I, Scarlett? Did you not stop to think that I needed my family, but you and Mother abandoned me? Now I am going to likewise abandon you to the coyotes." All of a sudden, there was a loud growl in the woodgrove. It sounded exactly like a lion, as if something very fierce was only yards away from the two women. Constance's eyes became fearful. She quickly removed the knife from Scarlett's neck and glanced around. What the hell? With the knife moved away from her throat, Scarlett tried to escape her sister's clutches, but it was no use. Constance grabbed her, holding her down firmly. All of a sudden, there was a loud, raucous scream. The sound of ponderous feet. Scarlett looked up to see this huge, lofty, ambiguous creature. It had pulled Constance off her body with a powerful bulldozer-like force. Constance began to scream in terror, the knife dropping out of her hands, slipping out of her fingers like butter, landing precariously on the forest floor. The huge creature was like a blur of black, easily about 8 foot tall, with a humanoid silhouette. Scarlett watched in abject horror as this curious idiosyncratic creature threw Constance on the ground and then plucked her head off, throwing it across the woodgrove so that it rolled across the woodland trail like a soccer ball until it finally came to a stop. Scarlett was terrified as she stared at this creature. She had no idea what it was. Was it also going to hurt her, she wondered. She tried to run, but she couldn't. Her body had frozen over. The creature stood only 2 feet away from Scarlett, staring at her through deep-set, dark, benevolent eyes, filled with incredible kindness. The creature's expression seemed incongruous compared to the violent behaviour it had recently exhibited. Did it want her head too? Scarlett wondered. That was when the strange creature spoke to her in a curious language, where the words were immediately translated into her head in English, in some form of telepathic exchange. "Anginassa, hunkalakanaktwati, akasikatolonopwa." "I have no interest in your head. I'd like it very much to stay on your head." "You mean you don't want to hurt me?" Scarlett thought in her own head. "But you killed my sister. I don't understand." The creature looked at Scarlett with a bemused look. "Akinakila, hamokotanaswa, fikanikala nokolo. I killed your sister because she was going to kill you. This sister of yours has a very funny head." "What do you mean?" asked Scarlett. "Ikantila no amaki, vaganasakwa, ikinatala no sho, pakila kokwa, isantala nakwanisi. Your sister is bad, very bad. Energy is black. She needed to go. She's been coming into the woods to feed the coyotes. I knew she was up to something bad. I could read it in her energy. It was a murderous energy. I've been watching her like a hawk ever since, every single night when she comes here. That's why I saw what she was doing to you. I knew if I didn't act quickly, you were a goner." Thank you, said Scarlett. "Thank you for saving my life." "Mami nasi, akinatuanasa." "That is fine. You were not meant to die." The strange creature escorted Scarlett back to her house. "Everything's going to be fine," said the creature. "Akinatuasikinapa." And then he was gone. And that was that. To cut a long story short, the town grieved the tragic loss of Constance Cunningham when she was laid to rest, all describing her as a pillar of the local community, a woman so savagely torn apart by a pack of hungry coyotes. But only Scarlett and her husband knew what had really happened,
So number 53 nursed its own secret. All these years later, Scarlett was to realize the creature that saved her life that inauspicious night was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Oliver and I'm from the Pacific Northwest in Northern America. And my illustrious Bigfoot encounter happened in 1984 when I was 12 years old at the time, and is an account that is so treasured by me that it has never ever been forgotten. For indeed it is as fresh in my mind as if it transpired yesterday. Other events, of course, have not got the same memorable effect on me. Without a shadow of a doubt, meeting the hairy critter that we love to call Bigfoot left an indelible, arresting impression on my mind that I shall never forget as long as I shall live. At the time, I could not comprehend what on earth it was that I encountered, because in those days, no one had ever heard of the hairy humanoid before. I grew up in a rural neighbourhood with my mother and father and my sister Dawn, who was 1 year younger than I was at the time. All the attractive-looking houses in our area were built relatively close together, with sizable front and back yards. Our quaint little country street was situated on a white gravel road, which had not been tarmacked in those days. All the houses were very individualistic, with all their own character and personality, some with leanings towards more historic architecture, while others were much more contemporary in design. One thing that all the houses had in common was that they were painted in bright, cheerful Moroccan colours that really lifted your spirits, with pristinely manicured lawns and very pretty yards that were always planted up with seasonal colourful flowers in spring and summer. Our house was no exception to the rule and was your quintessential ranch-style home that was painted in a rustic peach colour with a generous fenced-in backyard, a large entertainment area and a very sizable swimming pool. I grew up in an area with exquisite panoramic views of statuesque imposing mountains and vast areas of dreamy forest. In our part of the world we had prairies, silvery lakes, rugged outcrops and sumptuous green valleys, fields of crops, pretty barns and meadows with galloping horses or grazing cows, so I really did live in the heart of the countryside, and the natural world was my illustrious acclaimed playground. If you drove to the end of our road, you reached a fork that led to 2 gravel roads, and the road on the right-hand side led to a rocky embankment that towered up to an exquisite broad expanse of ubiquitous natural forest that was built up on high mountainous ridge, with a beautiful stream that zigzagged throughout the rugged valley and jutted out into rocky alcoves, forming enchanting little rock pools and cascading waterfalls with streams of water that jetted powerfully through the rocks in luscious showers of crystal white foam. It was fortunate that the hilly elevations of this sumptuous forest were made easier for visitors frequenting these woods, as the Forestry Commission had cleared the steep elevated pathways and secured some sturdy poled fencing to offer structural support against some of the rocky outcrops in order to ensure safety for hikers, walkers and cyclists. This rugged elevated woodland was dotted with many masterful pieces of rock, dense green ground covers such as ferns and various ivies, and trees that towered into the sky, crowned with glorious heads of resplendent green foliage. If that wasn't enough eye candy for you, the forest was like a lighthouse beacon for all the indigenous wildlife that frequented the woods for cover, especially during the heat of the day, to quench their thirst by enjoying a refreshing drink by the stream. It was not uncommon to see deer at the water's edge frolicking in the splendicious shaded retreat. Then there were squirrels that darted from tree to tree like furry gymnasts, and songbirds that would serenade you with their joyful renditions of tweets and warbles. These woods were frequented not only by the kids in the area, but local dog walkers or hikers taking a little morning stroll to sharpen their brains, enhance their physical fitness, and elevate their moods. Growing up, I would spend my days playing with the kids in the street, and we would ride our bicycles freely all over the local area, and we would take the gravel road to the left if we had a hankering for some candies. This gravel road ultimately led to some small, quaint shops in the town, including the very best sweet shop ever, where we would buy several ounces of our favourite candies that were presented to us in a white paper bag. In those days, 150 ounces of candy would cost exactly 26 cents. How much times has changed since then, because nowadays we cannot buy anything for that price. When we took the gravel road to the right, it would lead to the dreamy emerald forest, where we would hang out by the stream, throwing pebbles in the water, catching frogs or making white paper boats that we would invariably float on the water. We would play hide and seek, kick the can, hopscotch, and even jump rope in the woods. We would swim in the rock pools and even eat our lunches on a smooth rocky outcrop that we called the King's Throne. You see, in those days our parents could afford to be much more easygoing, carefree and somewhat lackadaisical as to our whereabouts, because crime was pretty much non-existent in our neck of the woods in those bygone days. Living in a small town meant that all the locals were very well acquainted with each other, and most people were congenial, companionable and friendly, with the exception of the peevish Mr. Bird, who lived in the mediocre, rather grim-looking box-shaped house next door to ours. The only way that I can describe the crusty codger was that he was a cantankerous, cranky old man that never wore a smile a day in his life, and was exceedingly disagreeable, crabby, and almost always rude. The greatest irony of all was that he was married to the kindest, sweetest, most mellow and chilled-out woman in the street, who was a portly woman with a jovial smile, charming disposition, and a great sense of humour. It would seem that they were the most unlikely couple. It was rather like a well-rounded Mary Poppins being married to the Grim Reaper, and people in our neighbourhood would often pontificate about how this unlikely couple ever came into being. "What does she see in him?" they would say. It was really like sweet and sour merging together in a marital union. But as one lady eloquently put it to my mother, sweet and sour Chinese pork works great in a combination in food. Perhaps it also works the same in human relationships. The vinegary Mr. Bird was blatantly rude and was not afraid to express his opinion, regardless of the offence he caused. Politeness was definitely not one of his virtues, nor one of his graces. That's if he had any, of course, which was highly unlikely. Mr. and Mrs. Bird ran the local dry cleaners in our town, and everybody always hoped that they would be dealing with Mrs. Bird when it came to any business transactions. One day my mother went to the dry cleaners and was almost met with a barrage of abuse from Mr. Bird, who told her that her kids, referring to my sister and I, of course, were a good reflection of her appalling bad parenting skills. "They're always littering the stream with their dreadful paper boats," he complained, "and leaving the crusts behind from their sandwiches on the ground, littering the pristine forest in a deplorable way," he chastised. "You should be ashamed of yourself, allowing your children to pollute the environment like that." "But, Mr. Bird," protested my mother, "the paper boats are biodegradable, and as for the sandwich crusts, the children leave them behind for the birds or raccoons to eat, so that's hardly littering, is it?" "More like encouraging vermin in the forest," protested Mr. Bird vehemently. "I'd like to remind you that the people around here would like to visit a pristine, clean forest, not a woodland running rampant with rats. You need to instill some manners in those kids of yours. Do you know how much damage they've done to my front yard with those bicycles of theirs, trailing their muddy wheels into my grass, removing the turf? As for that dreadful bulldog of yours, why on earth is she always lifting her leg on my garden shrubs in particular? I notice it's always my yard she chooses to mark, and nobody else's in the street. If I didn't know any better, I would say your kids were deliberately getting her to pee there, just to get my back up." "Oh, I'm sure that's not the case, Mr. Bird," my mother assured him. "My kids would never be so disrespectful to your garden turf, nor to your shrubs." "Well, tell those rambunctious, good-for-nothing kids of yours that I'm watching them very closely, including that flat-snouted bulldog of yours. I'm watching her too." If you think Mr. Bird was rude to my mother, do not let me get started. There was barely a person in our town that had not experienced the wrath of Mr. Bird at some point. He even told the pastor at our local church that his sermon was absolute hogwash when he talked about the value of giving over receiving in one of his sermons. "Everybody knows that's not true," Mr. Bird chided. "Do you think it would give me more pleasure to give $1 million away, or to keep it for myself?" he said to the pastor. "Well, you would feel good if you made a difference to someone else's life with such a generous donation," said the pastor. "If you were fortunate enough, of course, to have such a sizable amount of accessible funds to give away. It feels good to help others, and is pleasing to God,
who blesses those who give generously." "What utter balderdash!" sniggered Mr. Bird. "I'd keep the money to improve my lot. What joy is it going to give me to make somebody else rich at my expense? If you ask me, the church is manipulating people to give their cash, but you'll not be getting a penny from me."
"I'm sorry to hear that," said the pastor.
"Lucky for you," said Mr. Bird. "Your fleeceable congregation is gullible enough to fall for your sermons. But not me. I know exactly what's going on. And I'm no fool," he said, tapping his nose. Another time Mr. Bird told the host at a neighbour's dinner party that her food was bland, insipid and exceedingly dreary. "You really haven't got the first clue how to cook, have you?" he told her. "Every chef will tell you that seasoning is imperative. I cannot possibly eat such flavourless food," he said, pushing the plate away with a look of absolute disgust on his face. "And as for this chicken, it's as tough as a dried-up old boot." Meanwhile, his wife was apologising profusely for her husband's atrocious manners. All the while, her husband left the table only to return with a takeaway from the local kebab shop that he ate at the dinner party in front of the stunned, rather appalled and shocked guests, who were secretly green at the gills with envy. My mother told me that the food was so awful she could see that all the guests were drooling like a dog over a bone as the smells of Mr. Bird's delicious food wafted over to them. They all kept looking at him as he ate his food and tucked into the tender, juicy pieces of marinated chicken, pita bread and long, crisp potato chips, while they were stuck eating something that was told was steak but looked much more like the sole of a leather shoe and was so tough it was barely edible. "Is my food really that terrible?" asked the host. "Of course not," the guests assured her, doing their level best to swallow the food on their plate. "It's absolutely delicious," they lied. My mother said that after that dinner party, she rushed to the kebab shop as quickly as she could, because after smelling Mr. Bird's delicious kebab, she was unable to resist buying one for herself. My strange story begins when my sister and I were making some paper boats to float down the stream, when Mr. Bird tottered up to us with a belligerent look on his face. "I see you're at it again," he smirked. "Polluting the stream with your paper boats. You are both litterbugs, and I think the word bug is most befitting when it comes to the two of you, crawling around the place like a constant irritant that needs to be swatted." My sister and I said nothing as Mr. Bird rambled on about the woes of littering a forest. Guiltily, we both ran down towards the water's edge to grab our paper boats, to appease Mr. Bird. Suddenly we heard Mr. Bird screaming, "No! No!" and we raced back from the small hilly incline that surrounded the stream, and that was when we saw the biggest monster that you've ever seen, and to our amazement this colossal creature had literally flung Mr. Bird over his monstrously large shoulders and was walking away with him while Mr. Bird was shrieking, "Help! Help! Help!" In those few seconds that all this transpired, my sister and I got a good look at this titanic creature. I remember thinking that he was easily as tall and as wide as our front door, so that would make him about 9 foot tall. He was very heavy, burly, muscular, stockily built, and covered in long flowing brown hair. He looked like a cross between an ape and a man, and I remember his very long arms fell below his knees. The head of this creature was shaped like a cone, which flowed into the most Herculean-sized shoulders that I've ever seen in my entire life. I noticed the creature had no neck to speak of. I only briefly got to see the face that looked so human-like it was almost uncanny. The strange thing about the critter was it was taking no notice of Mr. Bird's caterwauling and was holding his arms down on one side of his shoulder and his scrawly legs on the other side, so that Mr. Bird was pinned down to the creature by his huge, humongous hands, which meant that he could not fight back. The critter glided away happily, whistling a pretty tune to himself as he carried the rambunctious, belligerent and protesting bundle of Mr. Bird away, while taking these massive strides with his powerful legs. "Oh my goodness," gasped my sister, "he's going to eat Mr. Bird." My sister and I rushed back home to tell my mother that a monster in the woods had actually eaten Mr. Bird. My mother scolded us and told us to stop making such terrible stories up. I know he's not a nice man, but you don't have to stoop to his level by making up such outrageous stories. Frankly, I'm disappointed in you both for being so mean about Mr. Bird. Maybe Mr. Bird was right, and you should learn to mind your manners. No, but it's true, Mum. A really big, horrible beast stole Mr. Bird. Go to your room at once, ordered my mother. Now. It was no use talking to my mother, but I assured my sister that before long Mr. Bird would be reported as missing, and then the adults would finally believe our story. Imagine our amazement when we discovered Mr. Bird in his front yard the following morning, planting some seedlings in the soil and humming away happily to himself. "Are you all right, Mr. Bird?" I asked. "How did you get away from the monster?" "What monster?" asked Mr. Bird. "What are you talking about, boy?" My sister and I looked at each other in absolute awe. Why could Mr. Bird not remember being snatched up by a big monster that we had seen? And why was he pretending that no such thing had happened to him? And stranger still, why had the monster not eaten him? If that was not peculiar enough, Mr. Bird had a personality transformation, much like someone might have a kidney or liver transplant, because it was that radical and extreme. And all of this happened after he'd been abducted by the mysterious giant-like creature. I'm not exaggerating when I say that, because he became very charming, complimentary, and exceedingly nice. He even handed money over at church for collections one Sunday, and the pastor was so shocked by this spontaneous display of generosity that he almost passed out. I would describe Mr. Bird's transformation as uncannily similar to Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. He suddenly became a very generous, kind-hearted man. Everyone could not understand what on earth had happened to him, especially his own wife, who was warming to her more amenable, loving husband. "I believe he knocked his head very hard," she told us. "He did lose his immediate memory because when he returned from his walk, much later than usual from the woods, he seemed rather confused, muddled and disorientated for a while. He didn't even know who or where he was for a moment, which was odd because he managed to make his way back to the house. He kept complaining that his head was thumping so much. I believe he did have a nasty fall, still no harm done, because he's right as rain now and has changed completely, but I'm not complaining. Henceforth, some people believe Mr. Bird had sustained a very nasty blow to his head that had activated another part of his brain, which actually can change your personality quite remarkably. It would seem even his interests had changed, and he sold up the old dry cleaners and opened up an ice cream parlour next to the baker's. When my sister and I would go into the parlour, he always gave us free ice creams because we were his neighbours, so we received special treatment. At one time we were bugs that needed to be swatted, and now we were his favourite kids in the street. His passion for ice cream was utterly extraordinary. He even went to Italy for lessons in gelato making and invested in the most cutting-edge ice cream machines, which he brought all the way back to North America. And it wasn't long before people flocked from far and wide to taste his outstanding gelato, and some of them were made from his own secretly inspired recipes. He made the most delicious cinnamon bun, licorice, apple crumble, chocolate chip and rocky road, and to date they were without question the best ice creams I've ever tasted. There was only one problem, that his wife, the charming Mrs. Bird, had a very sweet tooth, and her excessive overindulgence in the delicious ice cream meant she just grew and grew until she became incredibly huge. I remember thinking she looked so buoyant, rather like an inflated beach ball or a beached whale, which made her seem sweeter than ever, in my opinion. Many years after this extraordinary event, my sister and I would ask ourselves over and over again, what actually happened to Mr. Bird? I can only surmise that the critter, which we now know in hindsight was actually a Bigfoot, meant him no harm. Unless, of course, Mr. Bird managed to dodge the Bigfoot and in an attempt to run away, hit his head, but I think still that that is less likely. In some way, I believe he accidentally hit his head very hard, which activated the more sensitive side of his brain. I reached this opinion after a lady in our town fell off her horse, hitting her head very badly, which caused her to lose her sense of taste and smell permanently. Before her accident, she was a very flamboyant woman who was an incredible opera singer with a magnificent voice that could hit the highest notes. Now this very same woman is painfully shy and reticent,
loves to sew and embroider, and goes hiking regularly, yet she cannot sing a single tuneful note. It would seem that her personality, skills, talents and interests completely changed, much like Mr. Bird's did. So something happened to Mr. Bird that fateful day when he was abducted by the hairy critter. But what really transpired, we cannot fathom or even imagine. But it certainly transformed him from a big bully to a very likeable person indeed. Mr. Bird tragically died about 20 years ago, 2 years after his wife's death. Believe it or not, he left me his ice cream parlour in his will, as he discovered I had a fervent passion for ice cream and wanted the business to continue long after he'd gone. But he wanted to pass it to someone with a similar passion for the craft. So that's why he left it to me, much to my astonishment. I'm still selling ice creams to this day from the original shop that Mr. Bird once opened all those years ago. And it is indeed a thriving business. And like Mr. Bird, I'm passionate about ice creams and creating new and ingenious and inspirational recipes. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.